Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part 2 of the mapping series, where we're going to be going through the creation of a 2 versus 2 map this time. We're going to get into some more advanced concepts than before, and we're going to linger a little bit less on the more menial things of actually putting the map together on a piece-by-piece basis. Now, before we get into this, I should remind everybody that there was the part 1 of the series. You should check it out if you haven't already. At least watch through some of the theory and the discussions, maybe that first hour or something. Take it at your own pace. But it's going to inform a lot about what we do here. And it's also going to be some format changes that I'll discuss towards the end of this intro, and we'll get into that momentarily. Obviously, the 1.16.1 and SCM Draft install guides are linked down below as well. They'll be linked in all of these videos, so if you, for whatever reason, click on a random one and don't have these programs installed, well, you can correct that down below. Now, in this video, in this guide, in the creation of the map that you're about to see unfold, I'm going to focus a lot on map spacing, and I'm going to talk about how that differs and what the impact of that is between player starting positions, between map elements, could be assets, could be pathways, could be courtyards, and specifically spacing that facilitates decisive action. We don't want spacing where it just ends up with a bunch of assets that are adequately, separated from each other in terms of distance, but at the end of the day don't end up feeling like there's any cohesive roadmap to go between navigating between them. So it's not just spacing, but it's also how the map flows. So that's like almost another concept in and of itself. We don't get too heavily into that by comparison, but hopefully a lot of that stuff is intuitive when I go through it. And again, we'll get deeper into these as the series progresses. Spacing itself is very dependent on a couple of key factors. So it's mostly dependent on scale. That's how I would initially describe it. But there's also the size of your map. That's a component of scale, and the player count of your map. So how many players you intend to be aiming for. If it's an 8-player map, or if it's a 256 by 256 map in Starcraft Brood War terms, the maximum map size afforded by the vanilla game. In either one of those cases, you're expecting probably a lot of expansions, probably a lot of contact points, and a decent number of assets so that all players could theoretically coexist for a certain finite amount of time before one of them has to go so that they can make space for the eventual victors. So collectively, spacing in a map is always going to be scale dependent. You got to keep that in mind. And obviously the expectations of what players and of what you as the designer should have are going to be very different depending on your map's space, your scale, like how much map space you actually have to work with, and also how many players you're planning on supporting. Let's go over the format changes now. We'll talk about how this video is going to be separated from the first one and where I want to take the series in a format sense. So we're going to hypercut between some of the speed terraining footage, but we're not going to use a lot of it. It will also be generally sped up a little bit faster. The point of the video and the main lessons to be learned are actually lying within my commentary after I've made a change, and maybe my pre-commentary before I make a change, talking about what kind of decisions I'm going to be making and what my thoughts are about the layout as it's taking shape. You don't really need to see the act of me moving my cursor and painting terrain nearly as much. I'll have some of that in there for map flow and to sort of buffer some of the points that I'm making, and maybe because I'll say something and then do that thing and then comment on it afterwards, it helps to see the thing as it's happening in action. But in general, the video is going to have those periods of time be very condensed, and we're instead going to linger more on my explanation after the fact. So it's almost like a hypercut, slightly better paced version of the last session of the first video, if you remember that, where I just did a bunch of work and then talked about it. That's essentially where we're going from here. Now, we're also going to be cutting out the music. This is because there was some feedback that said that the music during when I'm talking is actually kind of distracting. And I imagine particularly if you're listening to this at double speed, watching this, or at any accelerated speed, it's going to be distracting because the music is going to get distorted in a way that human voices tend not to be. So we're definitely going to be removing those for that sense, and obviously still iterating on the format. There's still things that are going to be improved or changed over time. If you got some ideas, leave them in a comment below. And without further ado, we'll get into the point of me doing this video in the first place, making a map. We are just going to be picking a relatively reasonable map size, I would say. We're going to be settling, I think, on, let's do 192 by 192. Another thing that you might want to consider is making your width actually wider, your map wider than it is tall. Because of the isometric angle of Starcraft, it actually affords you a couple of different things. So for example, we could do 192 by 160 for our 2 versus 2 map. In fact, I might even experiment with that initially, and we'll see how that takes shape. We just did a jungle map, so I'm not going to re-up there. I'm actually going to pivot over to ice. We're going to set our default tile to snow, which is essentially the default tile of that tile set. And then we're going to set our triggers to melee with observers 4 players, because again, this is obviously going to be a 2 versus 2 map, so we only want 4 observers. And yeah, I guess we'll just go ahead and create our map. I think this is fine. And again, if I feel like I need more space, that's some of the early blockout phase will tell me that, essentially. I kind of like to go by the 1 hour or less rule, where you spend an hour on your blockout, and obviously that scales with how big the map is. Maybe you spend more or less depending on how big your map is. But that kind of gives you a sense for maybe what you're struggling with, and what if there is something that's constraining, or if your map is too big, in fact, for what you would actually want out of the gameplay. So we're going to get into it with this setup. Now, ice is a bit of a difficult map to actually make maps for in the canvas initially, just because everything is so like gray and drab. So we're going to want to spice this up pretty quickly, just like I did with my previous map. It's all about just, slapping shapes down, refining them later, but doing the initial work just to figure out where the mains might be and the expansions and the points of contact. And in general, the pathways you expect will be dominated by action early on. And then how are we going to pave around that? If you can recall your mind back to the first video where I explained my anatomy of parabola, a 2 versus 2 map I made, you essentially had these 2 very straight up and down pathways between the teams, and then following that, you had these external pathways that were almost like parentheticals, right? Parentheses, around the whole rest of the map that allowed you to take a more curved approach that would also sidestep and maybe backdoor your opponent in that way. So it's quite interesting to take that approach and facilitate that sort of thing with your level design, because obviously it will be taken advantage of by AI and by players, at least in the Cosmonarchy game state. The AI is actually a little bit smarter than you might give it credit for, despite being essentially dumb at the same time. So let's get right into it. Obviously, we're going to be using some form of symmetry. I think I'll still stick with XY symmetry. Now, the thing here is, because I'm doing XY symmetry, that means that, say, on one team, player 1 and player 2 are going to be in different starting locations despite being on the same team. So essentially, player 1 and player 3, the first player on each team, will be symmetrical. And the second player on each team, 2 and 4 in this case, will also be symmetrical, but they won't be identical between the two of them, which I think is a really interesting way to potentially create roles within a team. Maybe one player is closer to the action than the other, so you've got like 2 frontliners and 2 backliners. Or maybe you simply have one player that's a little bit more advantaged in terms of positioning close to resources or close to some, high value area with a lot of build space or something to that effect. So we'll get into that as our layout shapes up, but these are some of the thoughts that I'm already thinking about. And the other advantage of XY symmetry as well is that one of the things that I want to do is essentially create something like, I think I want my angles to be somewhat curved in nature. So what I'm thinking of is my initial pathways are going to be something to the effect of like maybe between this and that, right? So maybe we would even go a little bit differently. So we would do something like this so that they're not exactly level in a straight line with each other. Like if I bring this over here, the idea is that as I'm bringing it over, I'm kind of creating this arch, this slight curve. So I kind of want to emphasize that sort of thing. Instead of being like my other 2v2 map parabola that I mentioned earlier, where it's straight up and down, this one's going to be a little bit more side to side, a little bit more diagonal in nature. So we're going to figure out exactly what we want to do there. Much like my previous map, however, the Underwood, I would like to actually work out some water placements initially. Now, I like to use ice because obviously I'm using snow. So when I'm on the Ice World tile set, I like to use ice because it blends well with snow. And then if I'm going to swap that out for a completely impassable terrain type later on, then I will, of course, replace it with water at a later stage. So for now, we'll use ice. We'll use a brush size of 4. I think that's fine. And we'll figure out exactly where our pathways are slated to be. Another thing I've got to figure out pretty early on with a team map is where our players are going to spawn relative to each other. So are they going to be rather quick to reinforce one another? Are they going to be right next to each other? Or are they going to have a little bit of a larger distance, which would allow essentially 2 players to gang up on one and overemphasize it in a sense? It would emphasize the value of scouting. So we got to keep that in mind as well. And yeah, of course, aside from that, before we really get started, we should pull up our brush palette and our tile set index, so we should move those to our other monitor. So let's do that. Now we are actually ready to begin. As mentioned before, it's really helpful to get some color down just to alleviate the pain of looking at the same tone over and over again. So that's what the ice is partially there for. It's also as a block out for water later. I'm also going to start setting the boundaries for where the player mains are going to be, which is what those two pillars of high snow towards the middle left are. And then I start creating some negative space to set the boundaries very early on. Okay, we've got an initial layout to look at anyway. We are definitely starting from some humble beginnings so far, but that is the case with every map. It's just a little bit more pronounced when you have very few examples of a color palette, we'll say. So I definitely think that this centerpiece is really interesting. One of the things that this made me think about, however, is I don't really like the trope, I guess, overly relying on this trope of the centerpiece being very different than everything else. And I actually was thinking about maybe making some XY mirrored companion pieces to that centerpiece. So my initial thought was this could actually be a giant island. And then I was thinking, well, do I want it to be an island or a giant pathway, essentially, like almost a courtyard of itself, a bigger version of that centerpiece at Parabola, in fact, where it does serve as a landmass connector between two distinct halves of the map, two hemispheres. And I know we've almost got like this deformed Pokeball / yin-yang symbol going on here based on the minimap. So that centerpiece there would be like, in theory, a connection between either half of that, we'll say. And obviously we'll refine the shape over time. Another thing you may have noticed is that we seem to have some weird inconsistencies with the levels of, like, essentially the spacing between these areas. This is something I touched on very briefly, but couldn't replicate on the spot in the very first video of this, where XY symmetry and just all symmetries in general seem to have some inconsistency, probably due to the fact that Starcraft wasn't designed to be balanced via this kind of symmetry. Otherwise, they would have had like the same height levels for all of the different cliff angles, we'll say. Whereas obviously the north-facing ones only have two. So that probably was what caused that. I'm pretty sure I've corrected it, but we'll have to take a closer look later on as we continue to develop the map. Most notably, the upper left and bottom right hand corners are completely absent of anything right now. However, the companion pieces I did very briefly reference for this centerpiece over here are actually in place. They're going to be these islands, and I'm pretty sure these are going to stay islands. I don't think they will be anything other than that. One of the things that island bases in Melee maps always conjure up horrific memories of for all players who did play them is the fact that they did try to balance against Terran having liftoff by placing essentially 0 mineral fields there. So you absolutely had to drop a worker there first so that you could mine those, and then you could land the command center if you happened to be Terran. Now, I think that that's dumb, and instead of worrying about like, oh, well, Terran can do this and other races can't, you should just have the races be balanced instead of trying to do this whack-ass balance through the maps. Obviously, if you're not intending to make changes to the game state and you just want to make a map, well, that's going to be very different than what I'm going to do here. So if you were going to stick within the default confines of StarCraft, you might want to consider that 0 mineral field trick, or maybe allowing the other races to somehow gain an advantage without it being directly related to resources. Maybe they've got an advantage because, like, you know, Zerg are really close to their bases or something like that. You could come up with ways, if you studied how the vanilla races operated and what their advantages were, you could come up with ways to balance it for all of them, or maybe just throw your hands up and say, fuck it, I'm not really designing this to be balanced necessarily. So any of those are valid points for sure. One of the considerations I'm having, though, is these islands are going to be probably very close to one of the starting players. Now, I'm conceptualizing the mains like so, where we've got one player on the high ground and one player between these two bits of high snow, and essentially you're going to have a player more in the forefront and a player more in the back line, but neither of them are going to be so far out of reach of the other that it's completely impossible to mount an offensive. I would actually suggest that based on those starting locations, it might actually be beneficial for you to conceptualize this as having one player between the high snow target the one in the back line, and then the front line of the other team target the back line of that team, because they have a little bit more of a straight shot between each other, which I think is kind of an interesting angle to take if you were trying to do that. It does somewhat disproportionately provide a lot of influence towards this, essentially these sections. You know, if I had to select like the whole thing, I would try to, but obviously it's really hard to see the blue on ice because SI doesn't color code his things very well. But basically those two boxes, if you can barely see them, so I'll just skip them. But essentially the areas that are on the forefield or the forefront of the overall battlefield, it does make it so that there's a natural bias towards those points of engagement, because those are the contact points essentially. Those are where our frontline players are going to meet with the backline players or vice versa. I also like that there's enough flexibility that if you spawn as either the front line or the back line, you can actually still like theoretically play it as either one of the different roles. You're not so far away from the action as the back line that you can't play early aggro, and you're not so close as the front line that you can't play somewhat defensively. We're going to obviously furnish this map a little bit more as time goes on to add choke points and add different, essentially finalize the pathways and figure out where the bases are going to go. But I think the mains being in these aforementioned positions, which I will now place the start locations for, they should be in a pretty reasonable position. So let's go ahead and do that. So that's like roughly where I'm thinking, and I guess we'll go ahead and save our map. So let's go ahead and find the multiplayer folder. And then this is 4. And do I have a name for this? I was thinking, initially when I was drawing that centerpiece shape, I was thinking of like the snow goggles or something like that you wear in the snow to keep your eyes able to see. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not thinking of anything right now, so we'll call this tutorial map 2, and then I'll just rename it, probably in between this session and the next, because that's just how I like to roll. Let us continue. As I'm still figuring out exactly what the spacing is going to be inside these backline player bases, you'll notice that one of the things that I like to do a lot with layouts is I will jump between the bottom and top, or whatever the symmetrical areas are, just to get another feel for exactly how the layout is shaping up. I figure out the angles and try to improve based on that, what I believe the layout should look like. Also see that I'm making a little bit of space for bridges where I believe there should be bridges, so it's hard to do that intrinsically, intuitively, if you haven't already done it so many times. But as you get more familiar with laying out bridges and laying out maps in general, it'll become kind of second nature for you to place areas where you haven't yet placed the doodads for ramps or bridges, but you know exactly where they are going to be. And figuring out how to visualize those pathways out of nothing is a pretty important skill that is obviously tested a lot more when you're making more and more of these maps without anything, obviously, from a blank canvas. So one of the things that messing around with this has already made me think about is there's actually 2 things. There's one subject of negative space, which is essentially an area of the map that cannot be interacted with, but serves as a buffer between areas that are interactable. And it's actually a lot more important than people give it credit for. A lot of people have like a distaste for negative space. They feel like every inch of the map should be used, but in some paradoxical way, not using the map is actually using the map. It's just that area of the map. So you got to keep that in mind, and I'll try to elaborate on that with a bit more of a specific example later on. I guess the first example that we can go to for negative space is obviously anything that's unpathable. So this is all going to be water eventually. All of the ice will be water. So all of that will be negative space, in fact. And these things are absolutely paramount for providing map boundaries and boundaries as well for the gameplay. And remember that negative space in an RTS isn't entirely negative space. The only case where you would have completely negative space on a map, as far as RTS is concerned, is if like the area was completely useless, essentially, so that there was nothing that you could gain by maybe building a base over there, and there was also nothing you could gain by rotating an army through there, because even if it's not accessible by ground, it's still accessible by air, so you got to keep that in mind as well. But especially for those early initial engagements, or engagements where you are using ground units, negative space helps you essentially funnel the different gameplay paths down certain areas. And it's another reason why ground units themselves are so important in an RTS from a design perspective, is that if you have a disproportionate preference for air units as a bias in your game design, then you're actually going to lose out a lot on natural ebbs and flows of gameplay and the ability for level designers to specify specific areas of engagement. Because again, if everything is fair game, if there is no negative space, if air units are essentially the top dogs, then you're not going to have even the excuse for air units to follow the paths because they're following ground units, or they're attacking with ground units, or something to that effect, or they're chasing ground units, whatever the case may be. In that situation, you obviously need the negative space to have a purpose, and that's why ground units are important, but that's a complete side tangent. It's not related to mapping as much as it is just something to open your eyes about as far as game design goes. That all being said, what we have here at this point is a situation where the negative space is quite heavy in the map, especially the area that I just messed around with, which leads me to the other thing that I wanted to make comment about. So In Parabola, there's a section of the map that essentially leads into your natural, but the natural pathway that you take to get into the natural, that pathway could also lead into your main. And that's something that I really think is quite compelling from a gameplay perspective. So one of the things I was just thinking about is how can I provide more gameplay overall to the experience of playing and defending this backline player and attacking into the backline player. And one of the things that I thought of was, well, I'm going to have a bridge into a ramp, and maybe that bridge into the ramp area might actually also allow you to sidestep and go to a natural expansion. Maybe this is the natural. Maybe that provides you with an avenue to actually contest this player's natural expansion by taking a path that would also lead to his main. So essentially recycling the concept or the mechanism by which there's interesting game design choices or level design choices made for Parabola, but essentially building into it in a different way, having the angle of attack be different, and having you have to make a more pronounced decision because you're not entering into the natural to attack the main. You're actually entering into the path that would take you to the main and then pivoting to attack the natural. So it's a bit of a different execution on the same idea. And that's what I'm going to mess around with now, try to get myself a bit of a better overall situation, because obviously the area before I added all this negative space, it just didn't make any sense for that. So what we're going to try to do is essentially have this natural like bridge pathway or whatever between these two areas that I've selected that you can't see again because functional tools, but essentially this area. So yeah, essentially we're going to be taking this and we are going to be like adding a bridge here, obviously. So with a bridge here and a bridge to connect the land masses, and this is mostly going to be for our frontline players to fight. This is going to be the access way for our backline player, so to speak, especially for ground units. And maybe we'll add like a farther away rotation that will take you out over here. Something like maybe this could certainly work, even though I kind of liked the weird shape that we had going on before. For whatever reason, using ice and XY symmetry did not mix very well. I've cut out most of the sequences where I've just been fixing the symmetry. I'm leaving this one in just for the sake of posterity, so you know that it did happen, and it is something you might have to deal with. So just another thing to note, tactics for this to fix it are just basically brute force fixing it yourself. So here we'll obviously have like a bridge here, bridge here, bridge here, and bridge here. And the main like closest access point for the player is for the frontline player, like red and teal in this case, players 1 and 3, is going to be down straight ahead from their main. So you still get that kind of like single line down, but you can also pivot to attack it from this angle if your opponent has actually held this area overall. And it still adds a decent amount of importance to the central area, but it's not the only way, because obviously there's going to be bridges here that are going to facilitate the ability to essentially interact directly with the backline players. And these bridges that we just made space for over here are going to be really important for the backline players to get in on the action in the mid game, in the middle of the map. So that's also going to be quite important because we want to obviously have multiple avenues of approach for multiple players. I guess one last note I'll say before I get back to the speed terraining aspect of it all is obviously I was initially considering having resources up against this wall over here. And the reason why I decided to pivot away from that and put the essentially clear a space for there to be the player's resources along this ridge, which will obviously shift a little bit as I continue to make the pathing. But one of the main sort of takeaways from that, one of the reasons why I did that is because you generally want to avoid having bases in the corners. When you have bases in corners, they're actually buttressed on multiple sides, usually 2 sides, by completely impassable terrain, because that's the edges of the map. You can't actually, take an attack force and wedge in from, like, for example, you can't come from Blue's east because Blue's east is outside the map bounds. So you don't want to make it so that it's completely like unapproachable from that angle. You want to provide multiple angles of attack essentially for players to approach the enemy. And that's another reason why there's like a good justification for expanding this little area out and eating into the negative space I've made here from the water, because what's going to happen naturally is if this is the main attack point into Blue's area, he can just wall this off and then expand outward towards the upper left behind his frontline player. And while that's a strategy that should probably be valid in this map, I don't want it to be the dominant one. I don't want it to be rather the only one and have everybody who's trying to compete with this kind of thing be basically, I don't want it to be like so obvious that that's the only attack route in, and that the only way to access this backwards attack route to backdoor this player would be to go through the front line. I don't want that to be the case in a melee environment. I think maybe that could work very well if it was like 4v4 and one player had that privilege or something like that. Or if this was like a campaign map or a non-standard asymmetric map, then you could maybe have a justification for that being the kind of combat roles or whatever of one player versus another. But in this case, it feels kind of cheap to essentially give the backline player that much of an advantage in terms of being able to isolate all angles of attack. And to the same extent, I obviously have to keep in mind that I want to have value of crossing this bridge that I'm going to place over here. So when we cross this bridge, the value that you gain should be maybe denying an expansion over here, while also, threatening to attack blue's main and expansion, as we just discussed, and maybe also being able to pivot over here and obviously attack the red expansion or the red main as well. So we still got a long way to go before we can shape up where the actual expansions are going to be on the map. But I do think that what necessitates the kind of gameplay and map control that you want to provide, the opportunities you want to provide to players, based on those necessities, I would say it's quite likely that we're going to be able to essentially isolate like certain areas where expansions almost have to be placed for the game flow to work out. And so that's another thing that I'm going to be keeping in mind as I build this area is there's going to be a bridge here and a bridge here and a bridge here. So whence cometh the space for an expansion? That's something I have to find out, because obviously I wanted islands and I wanted different contact points. So I have to keep in mind essentially where I don't want to back myself into a corner, if that makes any sense, and have to make a tough decision later on. I would like to just be able to heads up, understand like what would make this layout work out from a top-down bird's eye view. With a more holistic approach to designing this particular area in mind, I did set out to try to expand the amount of space that would be in the natural for the backline player. And you can see I struggle quite a bit going back and forth with how I'm going to change this cliff face in particular. Throughout the whole video, but just in this one session so far, I've been doing it quite a lot. And I think a big part of that is a concern about spacing. I want to make sure that there's enough build space in the area in general. And I don't want to have to make sacrifices in the context of not having enough assets on the map in general for all players. So I've got to balance those two things, and that's kind of the problem that you end up having when your map is maybe on the smaller side, and you are going to have to cram some things in, which we'll cover a little bit later in this video. And here's me hand painting a feature that will eventually become some outpost. I'm not really sure why I didn't just redesign it from scratch, because it is such a very basic element of the map, but for whatever reason I was attached to the original shape, so I attempted to make it identical, even though I would inevitably iterate on it some more later. I did just have the idea now to maybe actually separate this, like cut it in half or something. I think if I were to do that, however, it would be better to do it with a bridge. It would be a bit more like thematic. I guess the idea of high ground allows you to play around it in a different way, but I think the negative space afforded for ground units by actually having a bridge there to play around with essentially focuses the engagements in that way. So if you do enter from, say, the backlines angle, the idea that obviously blue or purple in this case would be entering through this particular angle, and then if they wanted to come out the other side to exit through the other backline exit, then they would have to cross another bridge. I think that maybe that allows for not coexistence, because these guys are combatants, but you could have you could envision a world where one team could hold half of this central platform, and the other team could hold the other, or they could contest it or something. And contesting them independently allows them to be split up, even though the whole thing is still something you want to fight for. It makes the battle a little bit more complex, and it allows for, I think, a bit more of an interesting element there. So even though we're kind of reducing the generality provided by most courtyards in general, this will still allow for really dynamic gameplay, I think. So I am going to pursue that idea. All right. The one thing I can say is that this map will look a lot better when I actually manually place every single water tile. I did mention in the previous video in this series that I was going to talk to you guys about manually placing tiles, and obviously, as we got more complex, we're going to be placing more larger numbers of manual tiles. We'll get to that in a moment, but it's the most important thing you can do if you're planning on making use of a lot of extended tiles is to get your layout figured out so that you are redoing as much or as little work as possible, essentially. Because if you ever want to make a change to the layout, it's a lot harder to do when you've already placed the tiles. It's a lot harder to psych yourself up for that workload. So, brief aside on that. All right, so Obviously, I just did a bunch of work there. One of the main things that I wanted to keep track of is I was sort of tracing this ice path throughout the overall area, and I was like just checking back and forth to see like where the symmetry screwed up and where I needed to make some corrections. It also gave me a silver lining of having to do all that menial work was that it gave me a better appreciation for essentially what the boundaries of engagements are. Not the boundaries of the maps, but the boundaries of where the engagements are likely to sort of converge. So obviously we expanded this general terrain over here. The resources are going to be up against this edge with enough room for defensive structures and maneuverability of ground units in case you get attacked by air units or whatever. Obviously, this area being traversable allows the defending player to decide to station some units or structures there as well, because I'll keep it buildable. Maybe a slightly limited buildability, but there will be buildability there, so you can, in theory, gestate some shit over here. The other thing, however, is that obviously, like, I've decided to split the angles of attack into two separate bridges. So this one's going to be a smaller one, this one's going to be a longer one, and I'll probably make it so that this one is wider as well. As you can see, that's sort of the tiny bit of work I'm doing now. So this one should be a little bit more accessible in general. And what this bridge will allow for is, like, if you just want to attack the main, you can threaten that with a little bit more instant action than if you wanted to pivot away and target the expansion, which is going to be up here against this little back cliff. So actually, as this player, you're going to have vision of your natural from just mining this, which is kind of interesting. So that aside, there's still some other things that we have to keep in mind. We have to keep in mind spacing for base building, and obviously there's not a whole lot of space for you to build a base in this area, so I'm going to expand some of this pathable terrain, walk a little bit of it back, but not much. So the main idea here is that we'll have a little bit more build space. It still won't be perfect. However, one thing that we could do if we wanted to facilitate a bit more going on here is we could add another bridge that would be a little bit easier for this team to defend, and that would allow this player to take command of some of the areas over here and facilitate some defense in that general vicinity. The main thing I'm going to be doing here is to try to better separate the place where there's going to be an expansion on the other side of these two bridges, which is going to have the resources over here. I want to separate that from where some build space might be reserved, shall we say, for this blue player. So we got to keep that in mind as well. Now, the other thing is to decide whether or not to move the red player a little bit further off to the left. So obviously I've redesigned some of these starting areas, these pillars, if you will, that are going to be establishing the initial area of the base, and probably also have some like very thin ramps or something that will allow the player to make use of them. So what I was thinking of doing is maybe pulling those a little bit closer over here. This is going to be a bridge, so we can't obfuscate or obstruct that too much. But if we pull these ones to the left and conversely the other ones a bit more to the right, we are shuffling the red player down a little bit, the frontline players a little bit closer together, just a little bit, which should allow for them to be just a tad more separate. We still have this backline approach, so if there needs to be reinforcements, there certainly can be, and that's something that we got to keep in mind. But beyond that, I think the bulk of the initial work on the level design, I think is shaping up quite nicely. So we'll just keep adding a little bit of space over there. The one thing that is definitely true of some of these early blockouts is that I'm seeing a decent number of kind of awkward, for lack of a better term, bases where you probably aren't going to have a massive amount of build space in the naturals. However, I think this is offset in this case by having a really nice amount of build space for blue and purple in their mains. They've got a very wide swath of terrain to make it buildable. The only concern that I would have aside from that is that maybe their pathways are a little bit far apart from each other. So as blue, if I want to defend my main, I've got to come all the way down here, which doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, you don't want to get that like highway lag-esque feeling of building like a map out of really large blocks and then realizing, oh shit, each one of these blocks is actually quite large when you get into game. So we got to keep that in mind. Like, this is a little bit longer than it looks as far as a rotation is concerned. The other thing is if they want to go to their natural or defend their buddy, they obviously have to rotate the other way. So I don't think this is a critical design flaw or anything. I don't even know if it is a flaw, but it is something that I've got to keep in mind for the pacing and spacing of the map, allowing the blue player, in this case the backline player, to allow them to rotate around a little bit more intelligently and a little bit more smoothly, fluidly. if they want to get out of their base. So that is a concern, and maybe that results in me shifting where this player actually begins, so that maybe they are a little bit closer to the ramp down here, and a little bit farther away from their ally, which would obviously be its own kind of concern. But I almost kind of conceptualize this second player in this case as I kind of conceptualize this player as wanting to establish outposts outside of their initial sphere of influence. So if you've ever watched some of the melee games, the ladder games, there are some maps where you start out by building some shit in your natural. A lot of maps actually, depending on your build order. But there's some maps that's very specifically encouraged because you have more limited build space in your main, or because you want to lock out a choke point really quickly. I kind of imagine this map as facilitating that kind of gameplay for the backline player. You want to establish map control, even if it's kind of loose map control, where it's mostly like vision and faster response times. Maybe you even want to build your initial production structures outside of your main entirely, or closer to the ramps, so that you can have quicker rotation times and reinforcement times for things like defending your ally or attacking your enemy. And maybe that's just something that players can adapt to. It's something that I'll experiment with, and maybe we'll find out that it's not a great experiment. It could have been better, but suffice it to say, I still want to give it a shot. So we might reshape the backline player mains, but right now we need to shape the frontline player mains because they have gone largely unedited. So we also have to keep in mind how we want to pivot back here. I would say this kind of feels like an unfortunate area of the map overall, because in order to access this, you basically only have one proper path. You access it through this bridge here. Now, one thing I like about this is that you can bypass the main of red to go to his backline expansions, or the backline player's expansions if that's where he's chosen to expand. You kind of have that opportunity to completely bypass the main in the current incarnation of the map. However, I don't really like that there's only one avenue. So what I'll probably end up doing is facilitating another avenue over here that red would be encouraged to try to block off by taking a base over here, which there is going to be a base over here. So yeah, maybe that's something that we can do so that it kind of allows like that through line here. So we could shape that right now. Okay, I think that's going to be healthier in general for map flow, and the spacing between the bridges is also such that you can actually make very different things happen. So if, for example, we wanted a base that was a little bit closer to either of these bridges, that changes the dynamic. Whereas if this is just a longer army rotation, but it maybe is insulated from other avenues, so like if we were to place some high dirt here, as an example, and we were able to like kind of segregate the pathway over here from the pathway of reinforcing over from directly into the main, and kind of like almost pass the buck and kick that can down the road of like the contact point here for ground armies is like once he's already here, it's like really hard to root him out almost. I think that's kind of interesting. So what I'll probably end up doing is do this. So there you go. That's what we'll do. We'll have the water actually blend with it itself. This does leave very little maneuverability over here, but I still think that this is okay. And obviously we can also do something of a, you can pull this down. I take this opportunity to also quickly develop the overall negative space that accents the corners of the map in the top left and the bottom right. Okay, I'm not massively satisfied with this layout just yet, but one of the things that I do kind of like is that we have these like outskirts of high dirt, and then you've got what will be the ice water. And then in the interior, you actually have all of the high dirt that you see inside, where the frontline players are, is going to be converted to outposts that blends with snow a little bit later on. So I kind of like the idea of building within, not really nature, but like, you know, organic cliffs or whatever. I like the idea of like having all of that man-made stuff be a little bit more towards the central area of the map, and then we get more organic the more we fan out. It's kind of nice, even though it's like not really a thematic thing necessarily. It's just it's a nice bit of pattern, I suppose, as you radiate more inwards. So let's continue our work on the mains now that we've kind of figured out some game flow stuff related to whatever's going to be back here. The other thing we have to decide is how many expansions we actually want. So one of the things that I like to do is I actually like to, especially when I'm working with a map that's going to have a decent number of expansions, I like to hit equals on my equals sign, or my equals on my keyboard, for selecting player 12. And then I like to place a command center, roughly speaking, where I expect expansions to be. So we're going to do that now. Okay, so we know there's going to be 2 islands. We know there's going to be a natural for either player. I haven't actually decided where the natural is going to be for red specifically, but we also know that there's going to be one in this general area outside of the, like, I guess the main area for the backline player. We know there's going to be one over here that's going to help encourage people to safeguard this through line that will take place over here. And then we know obviously there's going to be expansion back there. So in this sort of initial setup, it does look like the initial way that this is shaping up would result in red taking this forward base over here. Maybe a little bit as their natural. That could be the case. Remember, we only currently have 2 expansions per player. We definitely want to have more of that. I guess when you factor in the islands, in theory, you have like 2.5 per player. But we would probably want like 2 more somewhere so that we can really facilitate the kind of gameplay that we need for the scale that we're going for here. So we'll fly with this for now, and we'll continue to develop this over time. I think maybe another thing that would help is actually getting the bridges and ramps down so that I have a better idea of being able to visualize where the players are all going to be. Having taken a seat, not Chris Hansen style, I'm now going to spend a little bit of time before getting those ramps down, focusing a bit on cover, which is a different kind of negative space that specifically is very small in terms of how much overall space it takes up and denies. But the point of it is to influence engagements and allow people to play around these borders and barriers a bit differently. Another tactic you'll notice, this is general map making advice, when you see me zoom out very often, it's me taking stock of not just what my recent changes look like on the other side of the map, but also how the map is overall coming together. Pretty important stuff, actually, if you want to get an accurate read on how your map is doing in general. So now the ramps are coming out. Those are obviously on my other monitor, which isn't captured by OBS, and I'm taking these from the brush palette. These are all included in the brush palette, so if you just go to Window, Brush, and load up the Cosmonarchy Ice palette, you'll be able to use these the same way. I've organized them relatively reasonably. I am improving the organizational tactics, if you will, as time goes on, so obviously, if you have any suggestions or complaints or whatever, you can file them in the appropriate methods. But for now, that's the best resource we have for placing these sorts of things. You also see that sometimes I occasionally struggle with actually making sure that they blend correctly. And there are some cases where I just leave them as compromises because eventually I'll make the specialty tiles as custom tiles in the tile set, and then I can patch this up after the fact to remove those blocks. For now, I think it's fine to compromise on the aesthetic clarity and cohesion as long as you are providing a little bit of function there and the map is maintaining its symmetry and balance and all those fun things. I'm pretty satisfied with how the general layout has started to take shape, and even though I have some concerns and maybe some misgivings even, and know where there are probably going to be some pain points, I think that after making some additional negative space choices in the frontline players' mains and their general spheres of influence, as well as obviously starting to place the ramps that will help me visualize the pathways a little bit better, I'm starting to see some of the values and the benefits that this particular approach has shaped up to be. So we're going to leave it here for this session. We'll get right into the next one. We'll see where we go from here. Session number 2 of our 2 versus 2 map in Mapping Guide number 2, and that's 3 twos. Well, before we jump into the work for this session, my thoughts initially, the biggest thing that I had as a takeaway from the previous session was that it felt like I had mapped myself into a bit of a tough spot, insofar as there are some spacing problems, or concerns, things that could very well become problems. So I did talk about spacing a little bit in the previous session, and I obviously mentioned it in the intro, said I was going to be doing a lot of discussing spacing. So my current example for something to watch out for in your own maps is essentially we do have this frontline player, we'll use red as an example, and he's got bases that are, in theory, his to take, but they are a bit far away from him, right? We've got the one that's over here across from the island, and you've got one that's going to be across the pond, across the river from his backline partner. Now, both of these bases make sense in terms of attempting to hold the fort down. However, okay, I've already got an idea for how to resolve this issue, but it's because of the fact that I was thinking of it in these terms that I came up with the solution, at least what I believe will be the solution. So it pays to, again, iterate over this sort of thing, analyze, like, is the spacing right? And you just have to visualize how far a walk you want the players to be sitting sitting through and making. Essentially, how big is that journey going to be? How appropriately sized is that journey, we'll say. So in this case, for red, if he wants to take an expansion, he either has to take a straight shot right over here, in which case he's opening himself up over here. He has got no map control over here, or he's got to do all the way over here, which is essentially the same issue as like ceding map control here. At least then your ally can theoretically help you. So in the current format, if this map were done, say the resources were placed, and we were doing like some tests or whatever, I have a feeling the meta would be for the frontline player to immediately take the this position over here so that they can exert some map control over in this area. However, I think the obvious solution here is just to move this particular base, the base that'll be over here, move it onto the other side of what will be structure. So the reason why we're thinking about it in those terms is that it obviously solves some of the spacing issues. It does migrate the player's attention a little bit closer over here. It also allows you to still like secure this bridge over into the third for the frontline players in theory. And then this essentially becomes more likely to be the third expansion of the backline player. We might even move it around a little bit to try to emphasize that in some way. And another thing that we could do if we wanted to keep the layout exactly the same way as it was, because I think it functions, it's just obviously there are, again, spacing concerns where in order to secure a base, you have to put yourself out of position, essentially. One of the things we could do is take the frontline players and just say, hey, you got more resources in your base than the backline players. You got 11, 12 mineral fields, you got 2 Vespene geysers, whatever we decide to throw at them. And that would be a very interesting, I think, angle to resolve the issue. There's more than one solution in theory. I still prefer the spacing solution here, the one that actually affects the layout, because if I decide I want to give one player on a team more resources, that's fine. But I feel like it shouldn't be, in this case, it would feel like I'm using that as a way to resolve a spacing concern instead of basically just making the decision that this player should have more resources for one way or another. And then maybe like taking, I would say, well-spaced expansions in other areas and just saying, here you go. They've got less resources because you got more resources in your main, rather than just moving them farther away or whatever. So that's my personal preference, and I do think it will lend to a superior layout than the other way around. Otherwise, I would just do what I just said, because it's obviously less work. It would be more efficient. But that all said, we're going to get started today by actually placing some of the resources and trying to furnish the mains and just that whole area in that middle of the map area for the frontline players. Because the backline players, the blockout's done, not in the sense where it's completely finished, but in a sense where it feels pretty good. And the other thing is, if I did mention earlier that I was kind of concerned about the backline players not having access to expansions. Another idea that came to me was, obviously, like, yes, they have this small build space one over here as their quote-unquote natural. I was thinking about potentially connecting the currently island expansions to the backline players. So if you wanted to assault it by land, you have to go like across the bridge, up the ramp, and then down a ramp over here. And then obviously if you wanted to access it, you had to do the same thing as like an ally or as the player himself. You had to go through this ramp over here. And that would make an interesting natural or an interesting third expansion for the backline players. That would obviously be quite accessible without requiring air units to get there, but it's in a very defensible position essentially in terms of like defending ground units. However, the concern there is, does it just become like an air unit check for your enemy? Like if you have air units, you can attack this base quite easily. Perhaps even, we could even say with impunity. And then there's the other concern about like, do I put the resource fields along this ridge so that long range ground units can attack too? Like at what point do I allow, like, what do I want to do in that respect? I'm not 100% sure on that one. I like the idea of actually making this land accessible just because I think it's an interesting flourish where you have this design element where you can access this earlier than other players can because your base leads into it, but it's still being like you're still technically expanding into what could be enemy territory or contestable territory. And so, yeah, I wonder about that one. I'm not 100% sure where that one will go, but those are just some initial thoughts right now. We'll see how everything shapes up. I'll probably leave that decision for later on in this session if I make it at all. For now, like I said, we're going to furnish that middle of the map because it's looking pretty drab, and we're going to see where we can go for actually placing some of the resources. I don't really mention it early on, but placing resources, just like placing those ramps and the bridges and being able to visualize the pathways, visualizing the assets is a big deal of making your map and shaping it and figuring out what it'll all look like. So it's all well and good to edit cover and pathways and make sure that those are, robust, and that's what I'm doing right now on your screen. But one of the things you should definitely remember overall is a map is not just its cover, a map is not just its negative space or its pathways, it's also its assets. So get those assets down, place some resources, play around with exactly what you want out of these experiences and where you think the players are going to be drawn towards. Because after you actually start placing these resources, it'll dispel any myths you might have. I don't even need to get to that point before making some key observations that help me improve this map's flow, because I've made so many maps already. So I can already imagine I place that neutral command center and I immediately envision a whole bunch of resources in various places and say, yeah, okay, well, that's not going to work for XY reason. So even if I don't fully elaborate on every single reason out there, it's something to keep in mind. It's something to remember. Make sure that you get your resources down earlier, the better, in my opinion, because that will teach you the lessons necessary when you have to go back and edit those resources to make them feel good again. That's going to teach you the kind of things to watch out for, and eventually you'll build that intuition that I'm kind of displaying by cheating a little bit and not placing the resources super early. So obviously, in this particular case, we have this, what was supposed to be a structure, a little ramp complex here that would allow you to elevate your Z in the middle of gunfights and stuff like that. Obviously, we can't really have that happen in the middle of engagements if this is going to also be the context for a base. So what I'm going to do is reevaluate the shape, the geometry of this particular area. And I'm going to try to stay somewhat true to the original intention of allowing you to change up your height level in the middle of an engagement between armies. But I'm also going to attempt to make it accessible from a defender's point of view. And probably the easiest way is to cut these little extruding elements and then retool the whole area so that you can actually place resources there, but still have a north-facing ramp on this side, a south-facing ramp on the other side, essentially a defenders-facing ramp that they can use to instantly come to their own defense, while obviously still having an assault ramp, like an assault accessible ramp, should the enemy attempt to exploit this particular bit of terrain. Now, this is an example of exactly the intuition I was just describing. I already know that I need to change up this cover, this ramp complex as I described it, before I can place resources, before the resources will be able to be functional, because I need to have some ramps there. If it's going to be a ramp complex, it has to have more than one ramp by definition, and that's what I wanted out of this area. I wanted you to be able to, as I said, elevate your Z, elevate your height level, and change things up based on that. So I get some funky geometry going, and I edit that up, and I figure out exactly how much space I'm going to need in order to get the ramps placed. All right, I think I've settled on what I want this to look like now. It's time to start placing the actual structure. That way I will be able to better understand what it is I'm dealing with, and it'll help me visualize stuff in general. We are indeed going to be placing compound, and it's obviously labeled compound snow, which is the source tile. It always follows the actual tile you're placing. So in this case, again, normally I have this on my other monitor, but for the sake of demonstrating, I will start clicking and placing stuff. Make sure you turn off mirror XY. Yes, Pronogo, make sure to always turn off XY. It's not like this is going to cost you an hour's worth of work later on in development that didn't get into this video, because who would want to watch that? It doesn't usually result in placing your stuff here, but if you ever do rectangular stuff, it will translate that. And sometimes it also, I think, in some niche cases with copy and paste or whatever, it can also have an effect. You may have noticed, however, that our stuff is not exactly in alignment, so we can change this by resizing the brush. I definitely talked about that in the previous one. So this is usually how it looks like for me, is I'm just going to start placing, sort of hodgepodge, left, right, and center, all over the place, and we'll see where we go from there. Now, obviously, one of the things you got to keep in mind when you're dealing with something like manually placing tiles, it does take a while, and the upside there is that you have complete control over what you want to do. If you've ever been burned by the randomizer, for example, over here where it's chosen the same exact tile to mirror in a very ugly fashion, I know that's placeholder, and we can quickly fix it while I'm talking about this, but it's a phenomenon that you should not be unaware of if you've use the terrain editor functions at all, the isometric brush painting. So we obviously want to resolve those kinds of conflicts wherever we see them. And obviously where applicable, we're going to take the opportunity to clean them up. So now that that's been taken care of as an example, since we are manually placing everything ourselves, we don't have to worry about the randomizer fucking us. If something looks bad, it's either because the tile needs improvement, which is certainly the case in some cases, or it's because you yourself placed them in a way that ends up looking bad. So it's nice to be able to take ownership over that instead of essentially just being like, oh, fuck, the randomizer got me, and now I've got to unfuck it by hoping that when I click this time, it'll look better, which unfortunately I have to do quite a bit. When you're placing these edge tiles that essentially are between two different tiles, the blend tiles, as I like to call them, you will want to manually do those through the tileset index. I will show that off in a moment. Okay, I'll move my brush palette to one side and we will go into the tileset index. We'll hold Control and left click while in the terrain layer, of course, to navigate to where we are. Or where the tile is in the tile set. And now we get to do the fun part of finding the tiles and piecing them together. Now these are almost always organized in some sane way. These ones are actually mirrored, so it will be a little bit harder to demonstrate what I'm going to be doing to make sure that everything matches up correctly. But generally speaking, when you see a tile, for example, you see this tile, it's in this row here, the second to last row, and it blends with this particular case because it's also in the same row. Now what we're going to do is we're going to find the tile that matches it down here that's also in that same row, but because it's mirrored, we're going to need to consult the one that matches up with this side. So it'll be the second from the first, and we will take, I believe it's this one. Oh, doesn't look like it. Maybe I'm pranked. Or maybe it is actually the same one. It's always hard to know. It looks like the mirroring got me there. So again, like I said, it's going to be a bit of adjusting in some cases. You do have to do a bit of hide and go seek there with the tiles. Obviously, because of the fact that you have to do a little bit of that Easter egg hunt in order to find the right tile sometimes, it might just be a little bit quicker for some of these, particularly the ones that are flipped in this way, to just do it by an eye test, see if it blends. If it doesn't, find the one that does. So again, in this case, we're going to be taking a look at stuff that like vaguely looks familiar or similar. It looks like this is the one, so we're going to use that. And again, the way that these work, generally speaking, is that the first row here is blending the main south tile, the south cliff, with the main north cliff. And then the second is the main north cliff blending with the outer corner. Third is outer corner blending with south cliff. And fourth is outer corner blending with outer corner. So that's not a very useful way of explaining it. Again, it's almost something you just intuit after enough time working with it. But that's essentially how they're organized, because that's how they're organized by Lard. So I just mostly just sorted it myself. Well, that was an experience. I don't think I've ever made these particular blends with Outpost before, so I guess you do something new every day in most days when you're working with Brood War. Now, we're going to go ahead and set our brush type to rectangular, our size to 2 wide, 1 tall, and select Outpost from the list, and just paint away. We have the luxury of being able to do this to automatically generate these. In the future, if we end up using a custom tile type like highest snow or something, I will show you how to generate these without being able to select it from the list, because obviously it's not in the list in the bottom left. In this particular case, I'm going to quickly toggle some of these different types so that we don't have ugly repeats. I've actually made a couple of extra tile variations, if you will, in some of these tile sets, and one of them is obviously an ice, where I made a bunch of outpost changes. So just a little bit of something here and there to try to liven things up and make it so it's not always the same thing. Obviously, you may have noticed here that we don't actually have a symmetrical approach for this particular ramp. It's 2 tiles on this side and 3 on this side in terms of the south-facing tiles. While I could extend this over one more, I don't actually know if I want to from a balancing standpoint. Like, obviously, we have the tiles right here, right? Although I'm not even sure if I have those imported for this tile type. I think I do somewhere. But either way, it's not really massively important. So I think we'll leave that one there where it is. I'm also pretty sure I have the tiles for the north-facing ramp. Yes, I do. It was kit-bashed by DF in very short order, so while it looks a little bit jank, it's better than not having anything.
Shout out to Suicidal Insanity, who made it so that when you select tiles from the tile set index, they do not add the null tiles to your selection, and then he never shipped that change.
Yes, placing custom tiles is indeed a pain in the ass. No, it will probably not get any better, but it's okay because it doesn't need to get better. You just need to have a little bit more time spent on your map if you want to include them. I think the best aspect of having these kinds of custom tiles is the amount of creativity they afford. And while it is a little ridiculous that we don't have the ability to just automate the process of placing them all, I will still take this over not having anything whatsoever.
Right, I'm pretty sure I've done both of those now, so I guess we can slap those expansions in. I don't actually normally start by placing the expansions, or the resources rather, for the mains of any player, unless I really do actually have a strong sense of where they're going to be. So it's not unusual for me to place the resources, like the first base to be placed on a map or something, to just be like somebody's expansion or whatever. In this case, obviously, we're theoretically doing it for the frontline natural, which isn't so far from the main, so it's not that crazy, but I guess it's kind of it's just neat trivia if you're like, oh yeah, that was the first base I placed. So we'll place them, we'll evaluate their positioning relative to what we expect the other bases will look like, and then we'll just get to placing some additional resources. Before I do that, I should mention that obviously one of the things that I slapped together here was just by counting off the number of sides we've got going on, I placed the ramps in what I presume is symmetrical order. So in this case, we have this one smack dab between one and another, which if we compare to this one is one and another. Now, technically, you could say that this is like 2 and 2, but either way, it's still in the middle. And then over here, we've got 1, 2, and then 1, 2, 3. This one looks a little bit saner, but here we have 1, 2, 3 on the side that's closest to the edge, and only 1, 2 on the other side. So maybe it's not like pixel perfect accuracy or whatever in terms of being consistent, but for the most part, it's going to be like fairly accurate.
If I had lore, I would suggest that one of my deepest, darkest secrets would be my addiction and obsession with placing mineral fields in precisely the right orders. We only have 3 variations, and yet I try my hardest to make sure that every single one is used to its maximum potential. Because I think there's something magical about walking into a base and seeing a really interesting, compelling, and dynamic mineral field layout that no other game has ever actually attained when it comes to resources in terms of an aesthetic visual element. So it's really nice when we see something like that in Brood War, and I try my best to have every single base I do have some element of that.
So I had a little bit of a stumbling block trying to place the resources in this particular base in a fashion that actually did not make me want to yell. So this definitely took a little bit longer than what I normally would have expected. However, it's probably par for the course, considering I need to marry the concept of an organic looking field, something that feels natural in terms of how the resources are laid out. I have to marry that with like symmetry, but also balance and efficiency. I'm not of the opinion that every single base needs to be as efficient as possible. And obviously I play a little bit faster and looser with those rules when it comes to making maps in an asymmetric scenario setting where things aren't expected to be super optimized. But there is an expectation that you're at least a little bit tighter in terms of how you carry your resources in melee maps. And right now, I'm not interested in deviating from that particular path, particularly from naturals or bases where players are likely to mess around with a little bit more. I did experiment up briefly at earlier versions of an earlier melee map I made called Kakadu Port, where obviously I had very strange resource layouts for the main, where actually some of the resources were up to like 3 tiles taller, more distant from the main town center than maybe they had to be, or maybe it was 2 tiles or something like that. But it was, significant, where it did increase the number of workers you needed to build in your main if you wanted efficiency. And it didn't really feel good, and particularly since it's not like I achieved something that looked really nice, because again, at the end of the day, it was still very symmetrical. So it's not even something that was like a calling card of one base that felt a little bit more unique, which is where I can make the argument from an aesthetic point of view that it's just a trait that one base has. Instead, everything is symmetrical, so all the players had this, or at least like 4 out of the 6 players had this. And in this particular case, I don't really want that to be a calling card of somebody like a base that's theoretically going to be expanded to every single game that's played on this map. So just some food for thought about that. Now, regarding the logic of why I placed the geyser up top, in this particular case, I want the geyser to be mostly unassailable from the high ground. And this is because, obviously, if you lose a structure, that obviously can be a lot more abused in that sense. I'm also kind of encouraging the player to still take that high ground and hold it, or at the very least walk around this little X formation I've got here so that they can hold forces that come across from this bridge. And ideally, my end goal here is that you're still going to want to protect your mineral line. There's plenty of workers that are going to be on there, and losing them all would be devastating. But considering that compound is buildable in this tile set, in this game state, I'm not expecting the player to just completely leave that undefended. I guess AI probably will, but the player is not going to. So like any player that plays this should be able to keep, like, maybe throw a watchdog up there, throw some static defense, whatever, depending on what their race is, and sort of see where that goes. But yeah, for now, I think the guys are being in an unassailable position. It'll help a little bit, with the security of things, and it'll also sort of, I guess it'll reduce, in my thinking, the resistance people will have to playing in this particular area and taking the space. It's like, oh, at least my gas is safe, even though at the same time the mineral fields are still not. So yeah, we're going to slap down the tiles underneath them so that I can copy and paste this in a reasonable fashion. We will put down the town center marker and delete the command center when all of that is placed, because at that point it's quote unquote final. So we're good to go there.
If you've been a good boy and started making your own maps, you've already done this exact process of placing tiles symmetrically and then undoing them and copy pasting and all this other crazy shit. So you don't need to see me do it again, but here it is for posterity's sake anyway.
So I've moved the resources down by 1. In this case, the reason being is that if I did have them up, as we move up over here, when I turn on the AI town locations, you'll see that some of these resources are assigned to a different town. It's actually just one mineral field in this particular case. But that is a problem because obviously at that point it won't be auto-mined by workers, and AI in particular will think it's actually another base. So they might even like double expand in this area or something stupid. Now, unfortunately, this isn't something that can be fixed, because I guarantee you this resource field could be mined normally. But because it's a weird kind of position, we are going to have to move this down, which will create a very subtle, maybe not imbalance, but it'll be a subtle asymmetry in terms of what's got what where. I still think this is true to form, so it's not something I'm personally concerned about. But if for some reason you find yourself really agonizing over the little details about making sure everything is symmetrical, well, for one, I would say that's kind of a fool's errand. StarCraft can't really be symmetrical due to the fact that, north-facing tiles are 2, south-facing cliffs are 3 in terms of their height, so you're never going to get that. But at the very least, one of the things that I will likely do is, by contrast, take this rocky snow that I've placed here and actually shift it down by 1 tile, just so that we have our, we got to make sure that things are relatively similar in terms of like buildable space around the resources. That's an area where even the little details will matter. So if I play on the south team and then I play on the north team, and I know like, oh yeah, I guess it would be the inverse in this case. I play on the north team and then I build like some turrets around my gas or something. I want to be able to, in theory, assuming the map is symmetrical, if I'm playing on the other side, I want to be able to do the same thing. So generally speaking, this will keep the issues to a minimum in terms of the asymmetries, and then players can probably adapt. Most players are never going to notice that that's a problem, but because I obviously just did, I had to make a decision as to how I was going to handle that asymmetry. Was I going to, like, say, for example, one potential solution would be to reset it so that it is identical, and then just move that particular problem mineral field to the bottom down here, and then we wouldn't have had to create any more space. We wouldn't have had to shift anything down because it wouldn't have been an issue. But I kind of like that layout, and I don't want to fuck with it because, as you saw when I was trying to mess around with something and make it a little bit fancier, it obviously didn't work out. So I'm not going to bother messing with that particular resource layout, but that's just some of the stuff that you'll run into on occasion with this particular engine.
Some people don't like town hall markers. To them, I say, too bad.
Okay, we've got the moguls down. I might replace that with the twilight dirt that I ported into this tile set a little bit later on. But I think for now, it's fine to just leave it as moguls, as the town center little marker there that what I always put down in all my maps. and we'll just see how that gets gets to change or evolve as time goes on. I am kind of itching to focus my work and my next bit of attention on placing some of the water, but I also have a sneaking suspicion that that by itself could take upwards of 45 minutes to an hour, which is usually how long I go for these sessions for, and we're already quite a bit of time in. So I think instead of doing that in this particular day or session, I'll do the tiny bit of water here, this little isolated lake area that I've got, and then, like I said earlier, I'm going to place some more expansions and try to get the bulk of the resource placement done today, so that when I do my next session, whenever that is, I'll be able to just have a little bit less work tomorrow. When you're iterating on stuff, when you're working on a map and it is taking a bit longer than maybe you normally used to, or you're still trying to figure out how long a map should take because you're just new to it, just remember, like, one of the things that I always tell people, and one of the things that's worked really well for me, is even if I think like, oh, I wonder how many difficult things I'm going to have to deal with when making this map or doing this project, just starting to do it will always be the most difficult, quote unquote, part. And once you're doing it, it's like the body emotion stays emotion thing. It's a little bit harder to justify stopping. And some days you won't be in as good a mood, or you won't be as passionate for whatever reason. But if you just do a couple of minutes worth of work or whatever on your map, obviously you don't have to record a video talking about your thought process and explaining it to what you imagine as a layman like I do. So it's a little bit easier for you to just drop 15 minutes on a map or whatever and move on. So I would definitely say take advantage of that and just get a little bit of work done here and there, even if it is a mammoth task, like placing a bunch of tiles, like what I was just describing with the ice water. It'll still be worth it eventually, and you'll get there eventually, even if you only do like maybe, 1/5 of your work every day after 5 days, not even a full week, you got your stuff. So just a little reminder to stay motivated during your projects and also to stay hydrated. I wish I could say it was planned that I would go from talking about staying hydrated and drinking a big sip of water, guys, into starting to actually place water as a custom tile. That's pretty funny. But not exactly planned. I just saw the opportunity and went with it. That being said, this is a small taste of what was to come for me. Most of my time spent on this map was actually placing water, as insane as that sounds. Quick tip is that I do find it's much quicker to just start working on mineral field layouts when you copy and paste an existing expansion's layouts and just start retooling it, because you don't have to then go through the process of finding all of the specific units in the unit list. You just literally start rearranging with Control X, Control V. So I think this is a nice balance of having resources in your main, obviously, where we have 10 mineral fields and a single geyser. They're not ridiculously spaced, but they're also not as straight and narrow as a lot of melee map mineral fields and resource layouts tend to be. There's even like a slight arc to the way that you're going to be returning gas, which I will have to test to make sure doesn't result in like you requiring 4 workers for a little bit of increase or whatever. That being said, we also have a little bit of a change up in the general gist of like the backing over here. I did extend a little bit of snow on the other side and essentially try to give a bit more build space back here, because clearly if there's going to be island expansions on like say the right and left where you can then use that to like that already adds value to air units or transports, and then you can use that to go that same direction and then wrap all the way around to try and mess with the backline player's main. And there's not a massive amount of maneuverability for ground units in the current scheme of things, partially because I want to make sure that the resources are insulated from ground attacks, and also partially because I'm keeping plenty of build space open so that you can slap down some, anti-air defenses, bunker, whatever the case may be. I might still reevaluate the placement of these cliff types over here and maybe use this opportunity to actually change that up, open it up a little bit more, maybe separate out how this has come to pass. And also because this is an issue that I don't think we ran into in my previous map, but it is an issue that you're going to have to keep in mind, is that Lard absolutely loves to have really busted towns. Again, you should be ticking this AI town locations box underneath the disabling use defaults, and it's underneath the terrain layer for some reason, the terrain category. Definitely tick this every now and then, see if there's any issues. I didn't really go over that in the previous video because it's not really an advanced concept as much as it is usually unnecessary. But especially if you end up seeing some weird behavior with mining, your units automatically like moving into very bizarre areas, ignoring a resource field, whatever, might be improperly placed. You can check that with this, as I did earlier. You can also obviously check for stupidity, because this is something where like the AI would actually just start building another refinery over here or whatever. So I guess that kind of seals the deal. We definitely need to resolve this particular conflict. So what we'll do is we'll get rid of that, and we'll try to like invert this shape basically. So I think that's probably fine. I mean, the one thing that does kind of concern me is that I would like to actually seal this off, but maybe it's okay that you can essentially take your base here and or like a slight path over here and then, move out. Or this is also a kind of a harassment angle into your base. This is a player who doesn't have ramps into their base. Instead, they just have like all these open angles. Basically, they've got bridges into their base. But I kind of like this as an approach because it allows you to take a quick worker and send them up here and have like a shadow expansion back here that's a little bit harder for your opponents to scout. So if they don't scout you taking a natural here, and you're like, say you're Zerg or something, or you're doing a fast expand build as any race, and you slap down a base down here instead, it might take them a little bit longer to find that one if they even think to look for that. And this is made a little bit easier now that there's this immediate access way. It's still pretty close. Like, it's obviously a choke point, so it's not massively impactful so far as like you're going to get a lot of units over there. But you can see vulture run bys or whatever in that particular area.
Confirming these pillars as outpost, as this man-made material, was really important for selling the overall aesthetic of this area, I think, and setting it apart from the more rugged, natural feeling of the organic cliffs of the backline players. And obviously, it also has some gameplay ramifications with the ramps that I've just placed.
I do think that this is a pretty reasonable approach to try to stymie any sort of aggression coming in, because you all obviously, as the defensive player, assuming you can take this base, are able to walk right up here and try to smash this area yourself, like essentially to secure the area yourself. So I think this is a pretty reasonable defensive mechanism. Obviously, if you don't have control, this is kind of like a win more scenario for your opponent. If they've pushed you back and you don't have anything stationed up here, they might be able to snipe at some of your workers with, like, say, phalanxes or something else. But most of the units that can reach that kind of range are pretty unwieldy in terms of how slow they move. So you should have some way of responding by that point. So we're just going to make a couple more changes to this general area, paint some more compound, and get another ramp in either side. That will really, I think, secure some of the overall feeling of how the frontline players are going to be able to play. And then I guess we'll place at least one more base before we end this particular session.
The ramp I'm about to place in this area is also meant to not just serve as aesthetic reminders, but also as an avenue for that defensive force to be able to lock this area down. And this is a little bit less useful for aggressors if they do conquer that particular area. So just in general, something to keep in mind. Obviously, you don't want to have to go through every single case and add a bunch of cover everywhere if you can help it. Open areas are pretty important. But in this case, I think cover is very important because this player doesn't have a ramp into their base. They don't have a height difference, so they need some other kind of defender's advantage, and this is one way where I can add it to them.
So when you're placing doodads, it doesn't actually have to be the same exact doodad. Obviously, if you want precisely the same walkability, well, you're shit out of luck anyway, because obviously the whole like cliff thing is different walkability. But the pathing flags also just change based on regions sometimes too. Like, obviously tiles are always going to be the same amount of walkability as each other if it's the same tile, but your units are going to take different paths depending on the regions. So you can't have everything, unfortunately. But one of the things that I generally try to keep symmetrical is the build space. I feel like that ends up being more important. So in this case, I was just replacing some terrain with a doodad because I like the look of it better. And yeah, I mean, I guess a snowed-in command center might not like look as sensible in this case. Just swap it out for something better. There you go. And now we've got a situation where you got two doodads. Now, obviously, in vanilla, sprites provide cover. Not the case in Cosmonic, at least I don't think so. So if I find out they do, I'll just remove it. But yeah, they're not going to provide the same gameplay effect, we'll say. So yeah, now we have a better idea of what's going on here in the middle. Obviously, I still have to decide what to do with the cliff that's towards the ally for the frontline player. On either side. I'm thinking of just removing it, to be honest, open up more build space. It's not like it really provides that much here anyway, so I think we'll just get rid of it here. And yeah, I think that gives us a much better understanding of what the sort of game flow will be like when you're trying to take and hold this area. There's a lot of reasons now to take the what we assume will be the natural over here. A lot of those reasons include having ample space to defend yourself and ample time to respond to threats and defend yourself from anybody coming from the middle of the map over here and here. Anybody coming from the sides of the map, we'll say. And then obviously, if you end up losing this ground, you have a bit of a warning time or whatever before they come in from here. You can also try to secure this area with some buildings to cut off any air forces that are trying to hug the side. So there's a lot of reasons to target this natural base. And I think that's a pretty nice angle to take in general. This would be like there's a conservative approach to things, basically, if you don't know what to expect. And your conservative approach would probably be to take this base. You would only really take like this base back here if you're doing some risky strat and like you just didn't expect them to be going some opener that would rush and punish you because you just won't have the map control. Like I guess maybe if you're Zerg, you could probably afford to because some Ovoleths over here or whatever would kind of cover that. You'd be able to see it ahead of time, but then you might lose your stuff. So who knows? Anyway, let's place the last expansion on either side of the frontline players, and then I think we will call this session done.
I don't ever fully go into this in the middle of the commentary, but when it comes to spacing out your work, I do find that essentially listening to the signals you're sending to yourself. Are you getting irritable about some of the overall decisions you keep having to make? Are you constantly feeling a little bit more on edge towards like an hour into your session or 2 hours into your session? If that is the case, if you're ever in a situation where you just feel in general like what you want is to stop working, then yeah, you should probably come to an end. I didn't really feel like that at any point during this, but there were some sessions that were longer than others and some of them that were more taxing or more menial or more boring than others. So naturally, after a certain point, you just got to say you're done. There's always time to come back to it. There's always another session you can do, so don't worry about it.
Well, there you go. That's our progress for this session. It doesn't really look like much after surveying the whole field, but I think it's actually quite substantial considering we've obviously got We've got 3 bases for either player, but we also have shaped up quite a bit of this frontline area, which had the biggest spacing concerns for me. There's still a little bit of a niggling doubt about the natural for the, we'll say the backline player, considering that it does still feel like that's not very, shall we say, epic, that he's got very little build space in his expansion. I'm not sure if maybe I want to revise some of how this is slated to work out, where you've got obviously the idea of double bridges, and then one of them goes straight to his main, and the other one will wrap all the way around and go to his natural. I feel like maybe one of the things that we could do is put him up against the corner a little bit more, even though I am kind of loath to do that, and then extend the high ground and have this be his natural. So he's got a high ground natural and a high ground main. Maybe that would be something that could resolve that. That way the space is kind of shared in the main, which is sort of the same thing that the frontline players got going on. I'm not averse to that idea. We can even still keep the double bridge concept because then we would just have a ramp that leads out here. So it would be something like this, where the ramp would be right here in the highlighted bit of terrain. And then, you'd obviously have something like this, joining everything together, and then the resources would be around here or something. But I'll make that decision. I'll pull the trigger on that idea or not at the beginning of the next session, I suppose. So again, get right into it.
We're back with session number 3 of my work on this particular 2 versus 2 map. I've named it this time. It is Dead Ringer. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the name very briefly. I think I probably mentioned that I named the previous map very off the cuff, but this map has a legit title. And I really liked the idea of naming the map after a ring, because that's kind of how I imagine this sort of exterior. It's not very circular. It's not very, it's certainly not a perfect circle, but it has some element of a border, something that is roughly circular. And I was thinking the obvious thing to call this would be Ring of Frost or Ring of Ice or something. But I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to go through the trope of naming your snowy, ice, wintry map, something related to ice, having ice in the name or some shit. That's obviously very boring and very dull and not what I wanted to do for my particular map. So what I went with was Dead Ringer, because I was thinking ring. What ring? What can I do with ring that's symbolic?
And dead ringer is like used in many contexts to refer to a sign of alien civilization, like or it's a smoking gun, right? It's like the people use that in a situation where it's like, oh, if we saw this, then that would be a dead ringer in this context. I think it actually comes from when people would bury the dead years. This is like millennia ago, basically, like centuries ago. People would bury the dead, and they would actually have a little pulley in there that you could use to pull down to ring a bell if you were buried before you actually decomposed or something. Like if you were buried before you had passed, then that would be one way for you to alert people to open your casket. I'm not sure why the term was co-opted to be used for in the context of like finding aliens and stuff, but I just thought that that was an interesting angle to go for, and I wanted to use it for my map. So there you go. I will at some point, probably when we get into the asymmetric scenario maps, talk about names and how they're grossly underused, criminally underused when it comes to setting some sort of theme. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But yeah, we're going to get back into development. Now, obviously, Dead Ringer has a bit of a tough overall spacing in terms of the amount of space that you have in some areas like the naturals and stuff. Obviously, we're not going to be doing too much to address that necessarily, but one of the things that I think we've done an adequate job of spacing out everything besides like the main and natural for the backline player. I think this central area came out pretty okay after all of this said and done. You've got this one, which almost serves as like a bit of a buffer, which it tries to encourage you to take it. And this is obviously the one with the double gas. Again, you can't see selections in this tile set, but yeah, that's the double gas. And then obviously you have. This one will probably not be a double gas, the one that's going to be the natural for the backline player. But there's like a bunch of different options for that. And, you know, one of the other things that I was considering is actually pushing this base back in a little bit. Not necessarily moving where the start location is going to be to the top right and bottom left respectively, because I don't really like that it would be up against the corner. I think it's fine for it to be up against this ridge, but maybe making opening up more space in general for moving units through this area, and then having those avenues like that. So before I make any changes to the layout, I do want to start on the ice to water conversion for the main body of like the actual ring for Dead Ringer. I guess I'll start in the middle and work my way up from there. Normally I don't really have like a rhyme or reason as to, when I decide to, or how I decide to start this sort of stuff, right? I'm pretty much just going to work through it and see where it goes from there. So I don't have something to recommend necessarily of like, oh yeah, if you start in the bottom left-hand corner, work your way to the top right-hand corner, it always works out. Like, now you just got to pick a spot that you think will be compelling. One strategy I do have is what I've called the set piece strategy, where I try to you could also call this the screenshot strategy. It's like literally, what do I need to do to make an area look good enough for me to screenshot? And like, maybe nobody gets that screenshot. Maybe I just save it for myself. Maybe I don't even save it at all. But the idea is I can theoretically do something with that. And we can just in general have a gay old time looking at some pretty shots from the map. One thing that is a bit of a concern from an aesthetics point of view is that we don't really have that much in the way of like terrain variety. We've got some moguls, we've got some rocky snow. It's very limited right now. It's very much still in like the gray box blockout phase in that sense. I think the ice water will be a nice shift away because it's a deeper blue, and that deeper tone is going to contrast with the pale white, the desaturated snow. So I think that'll work out pretty well. And then you obviously have the gray of the outpost, which doesn't necessarily contrast in a positive way, but it's at least something different. But yeah, like I said, we're going to be starting with this middle area. We'll just play around with it first by painting over it with snow in that sense. So let's see where we go. As we hypercut through this particular section, I would like to highlight once again that placing tiles manually is a pain in the ass. This is probably about 40 minutes or 30 minutes of work that you're seeing in a couple of seconds. Perhaps of some interest is that the bridges were originally not shortened by one more tile. However, I was able to experiment with blending them together and found that it actually passes. It's not that distracting to the eye whatsoever. By the way, if you're doing decoration, you can actually, if you're placing them from the tile set index, you can actually make them symmetrical. But that would assume you want the same doodad in the same place. In this case, I actually might want this one because it's kind of a mechanical, like man-made thing. But if it was like a tree or something, you wouldn't want that. So it might be useful still just to throw that down as a means of like, oh yeah, mental note, remove that, like replace that with something different later. We are well on our way to completing that set piece strategy that I was talking about, where we just essentially take from this left to this right over here. So this bridge, that bridge, and have all of that taken care of. And the other upside to this, by the way, is that obviously we've placed all of the other bridges that we intend to use. So pretty good initial bout of work.
The process of placing the tile manually. Here we see Pronogo in his natural habitat. He is turning his head from one side of his monitor setup to the other, gazing between what will be and what currently is. Will he ever finish placing the tiles? Some say he is still placing them to this day.
And there we go. We've done the center, and it's looking pretty nice. Again, when you zoom out long enough, far enough, you'll see, obviously, there's still plenty work to do. We're probably maybe a third of the way done with all of the hand-painted water. The bridges were a component of that as well. So, yeah. Just some other quick considerations. I think I don't really want to sacrifice this element, these two areas. But if I did, I would actually be able to extend this bridge and that bridge to match the sizes of these. I don't know that it's a massive issue, though, because I kind of actually like that the pathway over here that you have allows you to theoretically move more units for an immediate pivot. And by using this bridge, and then it kind of like funnels you through a smaller one if you want to move through. But the option is there. I do think that maybe it should be 4 for all sides, and then the central one can be shorter or thinner, so that it again, that funnel aspect, that choke point aspect is still active. But I suppose in the current landscape, it does provide significantly more value on holding this central area. Either one of these ice platforms, there is a little bit more value there. So I do kind of like this as a centerpiece. It's kind of a weird thing to call a courtyard because it is so small and there isn't that much open space, but it's definitely a battleground of a sort. So I would definitely still say it classifies as a courtyard. And then obviously the pathways that we've achieved through this method are, going straight through. It's not really exactly straight, but you don't have to make too many turns to go straight through. And then obviously the other way, if you want to take more turns, you could do, over here and to the left, or straight over here, left, up, like keep going left or whatever, zigzag. So there are some options there, and obviously we've got the wider ones that are a bit more dedicated towards coming out on this area. If I had one criticism of this area's ramp or bridges, I would say that in their current positioning, they come straight into a block. So either removing this to open up some more free space, which is actually probably preferable no matter what, or maybe pulling this over a little bit more, which seems like it would be completely legal over here. But I think, oh no, even this could probably still, be fine. Technically there is that, but it's actually only on this tile. So like we can move this over here and then blend it with, there's one over here that I think would work. Yeah, this. So we could do something like this and then move it over and everything would be fine, actually. So I think I'm gonna do that, and then I'm also gonna remove that little bit of high dirt. Right, so with the bridges in and the centerpiece taken care of, the map is technically playable, even though obviously we are still missing the water in all of these areas. Obviously, we also are missing expansions. We need to place the islands, the backline players, and the backline naturals, as well as the backline thirds. So what I'm going to do is try to finalize the mains of the backline players, and also by extension the naturals, by increasing the amount of playable space that is in the natural. And I think beyond that, I'm also going to try and explore an even thinner or shorter ramp. Or bridge. Fuck. I always call them ramps for some reason. I'm going to do my best to shrink this even further and then place it here and see how that goes, because that was an original idea that I had that I think actually could be quite compelling if done correctly. The only thing is I already know that needs to be extended out by one tile, which is going to make it look a bit artificial, but I'm not even sure if it'll work out in the first place, so bear with us. Well, I'm afraid that's as good as we're going to get. It's definitely quite blocky until I end up making some custom tiles, or maybe DF will, since he was the original author of this. But either one of us could do it. It's just until it happens, it's going to look like that. So that's just how it is. I think I'll do those terrain alterations I was talking about over in the mains of the backline players. Then I would like to just place the resources for everything, and I'll probably do a quick configuration of the triggers and stuff, and maybe we'll get the map test worthy. I'm not going to test in this particular session, but I'd like to reduce as much of the workload as possible so that when I do decide to do an AI run through, it's very easy to do so.
One thing I find really interesting about the complaints that some creators who are still starting out will often hand me, or just say in passing, maybe in some public forum posts, is they do talk a bit about how it is a little bit too difficult for their liking to do some basic things in the Brood War engine. And while I don't make the argument that it should be difficult to do basic things like mirror resources or place extended tiles, or actually have a game engine, for example, that doesn't just like brick on the slightest provocation because we're using memory hacking. I'm not saying that that's the way things should be, but I do think that there's an element, a byproduct, a silver lining, if you will, that if you're not really serious about making something, you're probably not going to last very long in this environment. And so we kind of filter out all the people who maybe aren't so interested in keeping their projects going. To what extent they would still find success if the tools were better is an open question, but just something I thought I'd muse on while you watch me place another base and then have to manually mirror it again. Another thing that makes me think of then is iteration, because that's actually the key, the antidote to getting overwhelmed about all of the different things that you have to do. You just take it in chunks and you break it down into small little sub-goals. And I think an example is obviously the backline player's main and natural, and how I struggled and grappled with spacing issues. But eventually I got it to something that I was satisfied with. It might not be final. I might make some more changes well after this video is released and forgotten about. But the point is that we continue to iterate and improve over time. So maybe just don't worry about your project being this one monolithic thing. Break it down into these small little goals, and eventually you'll get somewhere. Maybe not the whole thing, but some of it.
Well, all right then. We've got all of our resource areas placed. We've even done the ramp complex, or it's not really a complex, just a single ramp and then the high ground thing over here. It turns out I didn't actually have north-facing ramps for this height level, so I actually have rendered one out, but I'll add it to the tile set and replace it between this session and the next. And yeah, like I mentioned, I mean, we're pretty much good to go in terms of setting up a testing environment, getting the AI running. The observers are already done because that's what we picked in the initial map creation dialogue. And obviously we got a lot more manual placing of tiles to do, but it's mostly negative space stuff, and aesthetics. So we're going to get into that real into the thick of things in the next session. And I suppose that will probably be the last one for this map in general. So yeah, let's just roll right into it. So it's time for another session of Dead Ringer development. Hope you're enjoying so far. Obviously, one of the things that I was able to do between the previous session and this session is do the triggers so that I could have the AI taken care of when we decide to get into game and do some AI testing. Before I do that, I am going to make some small layout changes and place some more water tiles manually, painstakingly, so strap yourself in for that. However, there have been some updates recently. By the time this video comes out, there will have been a Cosmonarchy patch that enables starting without a single-player computer. So the little extra steps that I had to go through in the previous video are no longer applicable. I will show exactly the setup now. So if you happen to be making a setup for a melee map and you want to have support for use map settings for the sake of observers, now one thing we don't have the option for is, unless you're in a, how would you say it? Unless you're in a melee multiplayer lobby as opposed to a single player one, I suppose you could just close the forces for the bottom 4 players, but it's not really easy to understand, like, oh, the bottom 4 are always going to be the witnesses, the observers, shall we say. But this is what you're allocation would look like. Now, with the new setting, as long as a force, even if it has no players in it, has the randomized start location option ticked, then you are safe for randomizing colors. And we now randomize colors through the over 100 that we have available in Cosmonarchy. So pretty exciting in that respect. That being said, aside from setting up your forces in such a way, the other thing that you should probably make sure you do is at least actually play start locations for the observer players so that should you want to observe a match on this, you can. So we can do that a little bit later on. That's the one thing I haven't done in this map, but that should be the only work you have to do. You don't have to configure a slot to be computer. You don't have to make sure you place a start location for a computer. We've taken care of that. Veek specifically took care of that, so shout out to him for being a mad lad and diving through code so that we could actually start games without doing stupid shit to the map file first. So that's really the only thing that I wanted to throw out there as far as the brief aside, and I'll have a dedicated video that's much shorter and to the point so you don't have to like dive through a random shit inside a mapping guide to find out this information, so that there will be some like very basic to the scripted, like immediately understandable information where it's just, you want to make a map in Cosmonarchy's game state? Well, here's what features you can use, and like all this basically a annotated list or whatever. So anyway, I wanted to make a point to say that here because it is something that I did say in the previous video. It was true in the previous video's recording. It's no longer true in this video's recording. So now you know, don't need a single player computer for the sake of allowing single player starting. It's just that if you do have a melee map and you're playing it in melee mode and it has observer support, you have to make sure you close the slots in the lobby. So that's obviously a little bit neither here nor there, but it's something that I thought should warrant a discussion. So I did say I was going to make some changes to the layout. Let's talk about those. So I've been thinking about like coming across this bridge, and it is wider, but it almost doesn't matter that it's wider because like this whole extra tile over here compared to the bridge tile over here where it's not like basically this tile is 4 wide instead, or I guess this would be 3 wide, or no, I guess it's only 2. So this bridge is 2 wide, as in 2 tiles wide. This bridge is 3 tiles wide, but it almost doesn't matter because the third tile is obscured by this doodad and this cliff anyway, even if we remove the doodad. And basically there are 2 options now that I've made this observation. We can shift the bridge so that it's actually just 2 tiles wide, which would make it symmetrical with the others. I actually don't like this option because I think it's fine to have more mobility in this area and access for more troops and stuff, even though it obviously gets a little bit strangleheld, whatever you want to call that, where you are going to need to funnel your troops through here. But if you can at least take this middle area with a larger number of troops more easily, I think that's fine. And also, if you can attack out of here, assuming you cross the river, so to speak, then that should also be something that you can do. So I think all of that stuff is fine gameplay-wise. However, the other aspect to it is, from a visual standpoint, it would look very weird and off-center if we had just this bridge in such a way. I'll quickly copy and paste it for you so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But imagine like this is your bridge, and it's like off to the side a little bit, and there's like this bit of water over here. So just from a selfish, purely aesthetic standpoint, I definitely don't want that. But I also think it would actually be genuinely worse off from a design standpoint, shall we say. So the solution to this, in my opinion anyway, is to for one, we're going to go ahead and remove this doodad that we've placed. It's in the terrain layer, so we have to remove it in the terrain layer as well. Just keep that in mind if you're placing doodads. Like this is a doodad, and so if I try to remove it in the terrain layer, it does nothing. I have to actually go into the doodad layer to do that. It's Control D on your keyboard, remember, for the D. And the other thing that we're going to do to open this up even further is we're actually going to move that over here. Obviously, this tile needs to be manually corrected because we manually placed it. So we're going to do something like this, and then we'll extend it out like so. So obviously we haven't done this in a symmetrical fashion. We're just going to manually do it again. So delete that. And then it's something like this. And then we should be good. So it's a little bit more plain. It's not as maybe aesthetically pleasing to the eye or whatever. But now we actually have the opportunity to at least start to move out from here and get into a position where we can like then flank up going north, or down here we go out this way and start flanking directly south. Like that's actually something we can do now with this. Whereas previously it's like, it was almost didn't even matter that the bridge was actually smaller or wider than the other bridges. It effectively wasn't actually wider because of that change or because of that block. So this change is pretty helpful for that. And in a similar vein, I actually don't really think that it's cool that this thing is here blocking easy pathing between the different bridges. I feel like I understand why I did that initially, and it was so that if you were trying to migrate your way over here, then that would be delayed somewhat as an attacking player, and that would give the time for the defending player to have a bit of time to handle that. We can still accomplish this actually, and I'll do this in a epic way by taking the doodad that we just deleted, and we'll just place it there. And that way we have a smaller like block essentially, but it still accomplishes the same thing. So I'll just go do that on the other side now. Well, what do you know? I even placed it in the right spot and everything. So it's a smaller block. That means that we'll have more build space in this area, more pathability in this area, and also a little bit more aggressive potential. But it's not so much that I think, like, I do think removing it entirely would probably be a worse off decision, just because it is just that little bit of thing that will stop players from being able to very easily rotate between the two bridges. If you've reposted an assault in one bridge and then have to rotate your army, you've got a little bit of an advantage as a defender, which I think is totally warranted. You also obviously have the advantage of this area, but you know, it is what it is. And yeah, besides that, I mean, there is the open question of whether or not we should have another ramp over here or something. I think it's not as open as I maybe made it seem there when I said it that way, but I think it's probably fine to change up this layout a little bit and maybe do something like extend it out just by a couple of tiles over here, so that we actually have a little bit of an additional room for like defender's advantage. Like you can stick some ranged units up here to attack and try to defend. It also allows this to be converted into a choke point if players want to wall this area off, which we'll probably try to hint at by making the immediate texture under here. Like we could use moguls, for example, as a bit of a placeholder for what I mean. And we could like, you know, do something like this where we just play around with the texture basically. And I think that doing that is like a nice way of just saying like, hey, just remember, you know, this area is a little bit of note. It's a little bit different. Obviously, we can also achieve that with like pathable doodads and stuff. I'll get into detailing a little bit later. I think I said that in the previous session as well, but it's just something that you should keep in mind. Let's talk about tiles. So at this point, I think actually really the only thing that we have left to do besides testing and finishing the placement of the water tiles is we obviously have to do the placement of the higher snow tiles up here in the bases, like basically in the corners, like the top right, top left, and bottom right, bottom left. There aren't any other places where higher snow actually makes an appearance, which might be a bit of a missed opportunity, but it's not really something that we can correct now. At this point, we've really we've dedicated ourselves to this layout, so we can't really deviate from it too much. That being said, it's certainly not like the end of the world or anything. I think it's totally fine. I think this set map actually will be quite interesting and enjoyable to play. It might just have some core elements to it that might not even be something you can constrain or construe as flaws, whereas like maybe it's not a design flaw, it's just an element of the map. And the fact that one of them is that it has these wide open plains almost, and not too much in the form of height variation in the middle of the map. That might just be an element of the design. I do personally prefer when there's a lot of like little ramp complexes you can run up. I think we still have a decent number of them, obviously. Like we have these ramps over here, and we have, you know, this, that, and the other thing that is just, it's a way to encourage players to take advantageous positions. And also it's a way to like punish players that are out of position. Like if I'm attacking the red player here and I run up to this ramp, I'm like, oh yeah, suddenly I can actually start laying into him with maybe some phalanxes or whatever, like something that's fairly long range. I could definitely abuse that terrain. And that's something that I think is fine because of the fact that we've allowed for different positioning, essentially. Like if you want to cut this off, if you want to cut this angle of attack off, you can take this base. It's very easy, actually. Or you could simply just like keep watch of these two bridges, which are the only ways into this side of the map. The only ways by ground, I should say. And yeah, I think besides that, I mean, there's not too much to worry about, honestly. I feel like the map is definitely coming along. It's just a situation where the areas where I wasn't able to deliver upon, like running around a very large and we'll say like mountainous, rocky area. That's probably not even the format, or melee maps are probably not the format for that kind of map, but it is something that I do personally enjoy. So maybe I'm feeling a little bit of buyer's remorse having made this map and been like, oh, there's not really a whole lot that you can do to like a through line, a passageway, right? A pathway through some of this area. The closest you have really is stuff like this, where you can choose to make this a pathway by going like here and then here, right? It's almost like a right angle of some sort. Obviously, it would be angled, but you get the idea. So this sort of 90-degree angle where you come down here and then out, or vice versa, is definitely something that you can do. And then there's obviously like harassing this resource line or defending the resource line by, instead of choosing to take the pathway itself, you're actually just claiming it because it's an asset, right? Or it's of its relation to the asset that's right next to it. And obviously detailing is something that Ice tile set in particular, so easy to have a monotonous map without detailing. So we are going to try our best to make the map look much better. Obviously, I did touch on the idea that we could potentially have areas of the map where like you're blending ice to dirt. I think that's a great idea, but we don't have the tiles for it right now. So not 100% sure what I'll do to change that up. Maybe we can have just some areas in the interior that end up getting converted as opposed to the other way around. But we'll see. You know, right now I've got to place some fucking tiles. I think what I'll do this time around is try to essentially complete an area of the map, essentially moving from one bridge to the other. So in this case, we almost have like a very easy closed circuit that we can get to without too much complaint. Say that wasn't so bad, only took a couple minutes. This kind of map is a high concept map. Just like there are high concept videos or movies rather out there. You know, the idea is we've got a map that's going to require a lot more work to make work and to deliver upon a theme. And I'm only doing that, not because there's a functional difference, not because it allows me to do some different gameplay stuff. It's purely for the theme. So all the work that I'm doing here, manually placing these tiles, doesn't necessarily mean that much in the grand scheme of the gameplay, but what it will do is set my map significantly apart. And that's what makes it a high concept map in that sense, if we want to use that analogy anyway. I'm almost using it in a glib way because I don't really think of it in those serious terms, but that would be a way to describe this. So you probably don't want to start off your first couple maps making a high concept map, but this is what you would have to do. This is how I know it's possible because I've done it before and I'm doing it right now. And I'll do it again after. You just wait, okay? I'll do it again. One of the things that I like to keep in mind when I'm sitting down, especially with an incomplete or not feature-rich set of tiles, and I'm sitting here, I'm placing tiles like this, I try to keep in mind what are the essential tiles, the ones that I have the most limited blends with, essentially the areas where my creativity is going to be the most constrained, and I try to build those in first so that those can act as boundaries from a conceptual standpoint, and the rest can be filled in any which way I desire. So I try to essentially tile out things that are going to be very limited. For example, these outer edges, there are only two variants of them. I can't really blend these. Like if you combine these, there's obvious blocks, so you can't have those either way. So you can't really make any alterations on your own from a blending perspective. You have to use these two outer or inner corners, essentially, these inner blends. So based on that alone, you're going to need to make sure that the way that you've paletted them out, the way that you've tiled them out is pleasing to the eye, and as pleasing as you can get when you only have two variants of anything. So obviously that's going to be a bit of a challenge for anybody, but that will be something where you've just got to sort of suck it up and deal with it, right? And so like in one case that I'm already seeing here, you know, you're not always going to like hit them out of the park immediately, right? But over here, I've got like this tile and this tile essentially like not very far apart from one another. So I could replace that tile with this tile or something preferably that's not, you know, already there in some capacity. And then that obviously frees us up a little bit more to do whatever it is we want to do. And then I've noticed that I'm using the same exact outer corner into South Cliff blend. So I should shape that up a little bit. I figure something like, actually, since I freed up this, theoretically, I could use that over here. And then the only problem is that it's making this look a little bit less appealing since it's right next to that. So there's some knock-on effects, and then you just sort of replace it with something else. I think I'll even swap positions with those two just because I like the interplay between those two tiles together a little bit better. So these are like some small things that are going through my head essentially as time continues, and something that might help you as well. Again, finding the tiles that you absolutely must place and then being able to fill everything in from almost like that. Those are the outer bounds of your rectangle and you're coloring in the rectangle after or something like that. You know what I mean? You're coloring in whatever shape you have, but you want to make sure that you have a clear defined boundary of like what absolutely you must place first. That way you don't have to do as much work after the fact to pretty things up or to fix some ugly repetition or whatever. So just a little, we'll say a time-saving measure that I've discovered and tried to keep in mind the more I place these tiles in a painstaking manner. In this case, I just placed that one there because I know it's going to be a bit of a project to get right. And also, there are a finite number of blends there. So I need to make sure that that tile is placed so I know it's a known quantity. I don't have to worry about what it's going to turn into later. I already know what it is. So that'll help me shape the rest of this area. Well, would you look at that? It's looking better already. I'm definitely liking the vibe. I guess one correction I should make from my earlier tirade about how this is the reason why I would classify this as like high concept is because, as you can see, there's not really a massive amount of gameplay impact. This is actually kind of a bad case for that because ice is pathable and buildable in Cosmonarchy, at least. It's pathable in vanilla. So converting it into water actually does have a gameplay effect. I was hoping that it was tacitly understood that if I wasn't going to be doing this, then I would have, instead of using ice, used dirt water, but I probably should have specified that beforehand. Anyway, now you got it out of order, so if you weren't immediately up to speed from when I was first talking about that, now you are. But yeah, it's coming along pretty nice, and I'm pretty excited to sort of be able to zoom out into this view and see no ice whatsoever, just the coastal snow. It's going to be pretty banging. And after that, we can start working on the general decor, the high snow placement that I mentioned earlier, and I guess we'll just be ready to test after we do a little bit of prettying up just to make it a little bit easier on the eyes so it's not all completely white the whole way through, because I'm white enough. You guys don't need to see all that, so let's get back to it. So this little area over here is a classic example of like damned if you do, damned if you don't. There's one improvement I can make after looking at the way that this shaped up, but even that will come with a little bit of a mixed bag, shall we say, a mixed result. So because we only have a couple of blends here and a couple of varieties, I basically have to blend this north-facing cliff tile with this outer corner. And the problem with that is that obviously I need this specific tile here to blend with this one. So I guess maybe the lowest impact change would actually be changing out the type of cliff tile, basically, like changing out the order of this, the alteration. So I guess we would do that, and then we would just assume that not too many people are going to see the tiling stuff. With only two inner corners, you're bound to have some overlap anyway, so... that does mean we have to change this, though. But we can't do that because this is the only blend. Okay, so we have to instead stake our claim around here. Okay, that is unfortunate, but it is still something we can work with. We're still kind of fucking around here, unfortunately. Just sort of passing the buck, so to speak. But it is still a slight improvement, so I'll take it, even though it was a little bit more roundabout than I thought it would be. Sometimes you gotta make the hard calls, man. All right, well, it wasn't without some unnecessary hardships, but we have placed, as far as I can tell, the last water tile. And that is very, very exciting. The coastal snow has been deployed. Well, there we have it. The high snow is placed. Took a fraction of the time the coastal snow did, of course. It's just generally less arduous to place those. Obviously, we still have a glaring issue insofar as the paleness of the map. It's quite an issue for getting invested in actually playing it, I imagine. It would be quite an eye strain. And just in general, one of the things that I'll talk about once we get into the more unorthodox maps, the ones that aren't labored by the restraints of needing to be symmetrical. Those kinds of maps will be a little bit different, and we'll talk a little bit about making each area feel unique. It's still possible to do that in Melee. I would check out the Yin Yang map by Veek, where half of the map is a little bit of a completely like different art direction, you could say, but theoretically still symmetrical. For the most part, it's going to be balanced. So it's still possible to achieve with symmetrical maps, but it's one of those things that you have to keep in mind and actually design your map around, of course. So that's like an example of like a demo or concept or whatever for that. If you were curious, you could take a look at that. Now, aside from that, though, we obviously have some testing to do, and we want to improve the map's visuals. Obviously, we're going to get into a cursory test and see how we feel the map is actually playing out, and also how AI specifically are doing on it. Maybe we'll find something that we would like to improve or change about the layout itself, and then after we're pretty sure that everything is good to go, we can actually finalize the map's visuals via a detailing pass. So stay tuned for that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to do some AI testing of my map, Dead Ringer. Of course, this is the first time I'll be seeing it in action. I've just done a very brief startup test to make sure that the observer trigger worked. And as you can see, we don't actually need a single player allower anymore. I know I touched on that just in the previous section, but bears repeating. The other thing that bears repeating, and this one is from the previous video in the series, when you're testing with Cosmonarchy AI, unless you've actually gone through the effort like a complete lunatic, which I would commend, but not necessarily recommend, if you know what I mean, to make map-specific AI for your melee map for the purpose of testing to see if specific areas are busted or something, you're not going to be able to take sweeping assertions and test them in terms of how the AI exploits your terrain and some of the more like specific and fine army management concepts. So you're going to be able to see kiting, you're going to be able to see, again, this is assuming you're playing with Cosmonarchy, you'll be able to see a lot of things after a test like this, but you're not going to be able to see everything, and that's where obviously testing with players comes into play. So grab a couple of your friends and see if they want to play. Of course, failing that, or just before you get to the point where it's ready to be tested by human players, I do always recommend and like to do myself some AI testing where I observe. Maybe I play alongside AI, whatever the case may be. For the sake of just this video, I will just be showing the AI test, but theoretically, after some play tests, the map might change. The map might get some changes down the line. And we don't really show off all of those changes, like decor updates or layout improvements after some feedback cycles, because eventually you want to be able to release the video without necessarily having put the map through every single pace possible. But, you know, that's why this is the mapping primer, right? It's a sort of a starter guide for pretty much anybody who's interested in it, not necessarily the exhaustive start to finish process of iterating on a map, which might take several months depending on how long it takes. So just wanted to throw all that stuff out there. We are going to be getting into this. So what am I going to be looking for? I did have that spiel about AI and what you can and can't take away from a test with AI. Obviously, one of the things you want to take away from is how well the pathways are doing. And when it comes to AI and 2v2s or larger maps than just 1v1 maps, one of the things that the AI do, at least hopefully they'll do in your testing, is they'll defend themselves. They'll defend one another. And so you'll be able to see not just army rotations and courtyards and how well everything is coming together on the layout front when it comes to head-to-head army fights, but also rotations and can an AI defend its ally, and is it theoretically possible? Maybe even if it doesn't happen, you'll be able to assess for yourself, well, based on where the AI was with their army, would they have been able to rotate easily enough? Because sometimes, of course, the AI works in mysterious ways. So you never know what they will or won't do, but it can be helpful to shadow box that based on some situations. And that's probably the most important and useful aspect of AI testing, is they're going to do things that are obviously going to be very different from a player. And that will allow you to at least tap into a headspace where you're thinking and considering a couple of different values there. You're trying to figure out, like, okay, does it make sense actually to have this particular area of the map placed this way, or have this spacing, and maybe the AI does something that exploits an issue, or inadvertently, brings light to some problem, or maybe gives you an idea to improve it, or maybe reaffirms how useful it actually is. Who knows? Obviously, case-by-case basis. But just wanted to get that out of the way. Let's get into the testing. This is Dead Ringer. It's a 2 versus 2 Ice World map, and while it doesn't look too pretty just yet, it will eventually be updated. Right now, we want to make sure that that layout looks good before we move on into another dimension entirely. So it looks like we've got a mirror matchup insofar as we've got Zerg and Protoss versus Zerg and Protoss. However, the inner players are not mirrored. So we actually have the Zerg being like the lowly frontline player over here. This is like some auburn color or something. Japanese violet, there you go. And then down here in the bottom left, we have the Persian orange. Of course, I'll just call these violet and orange. I'm not going to call them by their full name the whole time. This is a mint color in the bottom right, and this is a teal color in the top right. So this is actually one of the only vanilla colors. And by the way I'm doing that is holding shift for more details when I mouse over the armor tooltip. So yeah, there you go. That's the way that it is. Ooh, that does not look too hot. Well, DF, when you watch this, I'm sure you'll have some idea on how to fix that one, if it's even possible. It might just be an ice-specific issue. DF fixed this issue 2.5 hours after I reported it. DF is a man. So one of the things I was actually kind of curious about as this map was being put together is the distance between like rotating into the expansion, right? And this AI chose to go up and around, which to me is kind of the longer way, where it's a little bit easier to go to the right and then back. So I'm not really sure why they decided to do that. Maybe they were just like that Droleth right there might like decollided up and sort of north of its base. Maybe that's like where it was when it got assigned over there or whatever. But we do indeed have expansions going down, and you know what? They're almost in reasonable locations. A pro tip, a pro no-go tip: if you end up in a situation where you have start locations to spare, even if you don't intend on having them like used, and you set their race to inactive or their controller to inactive or neutral or something, it can still actually be useful to place them on bases that are difficult for the AI to place town centers correctly. This player did not place the town center correctly. It's offset to the right by 1. And the same is actually true for this player. I believe this is offset to the right by 1, at least judging by the town center marker that I had placed there. So it's kind of interesting to see how that shapes up. And I might even experiment in the future with like actually shifting the start location to the left by 1 tile and see if that changes anything. Because these actually do have start locations on them. I placed them for the naturals just because I feel like probably the most important base for accurate town center placement happens to be the natural expansion. It's the one that they're going to take the first. So the other thing that you may have noticed if you've made enough maps using Cosmonarchy's game state, or just using any AI that expands actually, is that sometimes the AI choose very bizarre expansion tactics. So like I would have been surprised, but and I guess technically it still is possible for this particular top right AI, but it would have not necessarily completely blown my mind if an AI decided to take the island expansion as their natural, the one that is here and here, respectively. So I think that is kind of interesting. It didn't happen so far, and it's probably a good thing, but it's just something you want to keep in mind, generally speaking, is don't be surprised if the AI decides that they think they know a better expansion than you do, than you intended for the natural. So it looks like our first attack here is just going to be a small handful of zealots. We do have oh no, that's a Dracoden. Okay, so it's a very small squad, but this is a 4-gate build. This is actually a 5-gate build, believe it or not. 5-gate, no expo. Fuck it, we're scribing up. We're going whole hog, and we're even going to charge in and not do anything because we decided not to wait for our unit. And the Dracoden will even decide, fuck that, fuck this bitch, I'm out. Or whatever that, oh no, it's fuck this shit, I'm out. Whatever, I got the wrong profanity, but you get the idea. It looks like there will be indeed an expansion from the inner player. So again, one of the things that I also wanted to keep track of in this case is like the economy. And Zerg do have a bit of a tough time keeping their Droleths balanced. And something that I might want to consider is bringing the mineral fields in all of these bases, or at least specific bases in particular, maybe bring them a little bit closer in general so that we don't have them being as far apart, because that will hurt all races, but I think Zerg specifically, because they do have these very low worker counts in the early game. However, I think we're getting to the point where this AI won't be quite so difficult or poorly off. In fact, this top AI, the frontline player, has actually had a really good time drolething up, as it were. Maybe we would just call that drolling up. I'm not sure. Comment below what we should call the act of workering up. So, obviously, there's going to be a follow-up attack here, which is interesting. This player has decided to abandon his defense at the perfect time, and here we go. Don't think you'll be splitting anytime soon, homie. Well, you will, but you die instantly anyway. So it's kind of hard to see these two colors. I guess actually mint and teal should probably be in the same color. I had this in green, but it's clearly it's clearly a difficult one. No, don't worry, that'll be fixed in the very next build of this plugin. So it looks like we're going to see some dead scribes, but the bulk of the force is over here denying this expansion, which should indeed go down. Pretty good. Well, obviously, the Ecclesiast had plenty of time to target that one, so there's plenty of shield restores as a result. Vassals are going down, and they're not really in a position to help. This one is in a bit more of a position to enchant a lot of allies, but it doesn't look like it's massively successful. So, okay. The biggest takeaway from that one is it was very easy for this player to just barrel on in, but I think that's mostly to do with the fact that the inner player just didn't have an army there, right? They had just sent the attack force out, and so it was actually really good timing in general. I was expecting to have seen maybe some corpses of Zerg units around, but I actually don't. It looks like they're messing up for their first proper attack. Maybe they sent some very small fish over there, and they have drolled up in their main, actually. That is indeed happening. So wouldn't be entirely surprised if that ends up being something that rings true later on. This looks like a bit of a pincer, which is pretty neat. However, we do have a lot of units and a lot of production available for this player. He's actually ascending to tier 3 already, and he's got a very nice bottleneck here while his reinforcements stream in from the main. So even though this colony over here has fallen, it's mostly just preoccupy the Protoss, which is just a classic, like, oh no, I'll attack move and then not fucking do anything else. Move by the AI, but it's okay because, you know, there are still, you know, there's some Droleth corpses. I see at least 3, and that's 3. It looks like not too many of them are dying, but this is still a lot of lost mining time, so that's got some value. The donation of a single Ecclesiast was very helpful for reposting that particular assault, and indeed we do have this expansion being set up yet again. While Strike Force from Teal in the top right is trying to repost this over here. Okay, it's working as well. Vassals are executing some Ecclesiasts. You'll have to see that. And this guy actually was going to expand, but he's just been pumping units out with his, count them, 7 gates off of 1 base. So he has no money to expand because he's a goofball. So that's pretty good. Meanwhile, Nathracors. Yeah, I haven't really been keeping track of tech so far in this mock castover. But we do indeed have tier 3 for this Zerg as well. So that's pretty fast tier 3 for both Zerg players. Now, I know what you're thinking. Holy shit. Pernogo actually fixed the AI so that they tech up. Don't get ahead of yourself there, buddy. I'm sure they'll find some unique way to disappoint you and shock you with incompetence. Just you wait. Speaking of shocking us, although not with incompetence this time, we're actually seeing the AI take that 3rd in the top left. I'm just watching this battle unfold meanwhile. The kiting continues. Kiting intensifies, as a matter of fact. Now, I don't know about a larval colony in such a position, but you know what? I'm not the kooky guy here. That's a lot of Hydralisks. I like the cut of this guy's jib, dude. He still thinks this is Project Hydra, as a matter of fact. So this is an interesting 3rd base taken from the AI. This is exactly what I was expecting, believe it or not. Oh, this is actually, dude, this guy's taking his 4th. I didn't even notice that this base had gotten set up. So this purple man, this violet man, violent. He's putting the N in violet, if you know what I mean. He's doing his fucking job as the front line. And in fact, he's probably carrying this guy. Like, let's be honest, the early aggression from our top right teal man was pretty useful in slowing down the Robo-Protoss, as I like to call them, the Robotoss. And you know what? They've got architects, so they have gotten up to some respectable amount of tech. But at this point, you have to wonder, like, you know, there's going to be some punish from this Zerg player who's got a lot of bases, and he's doing everything. He's Maynarding. He's a professional. Okay, this man knows what he's doing. He's probably played Flame Knives, as a matter of fact. I'm just waiting for the drop for the island. I wonder which Zerg will take it first. Finally, we do have a Nexus, which has finished warping in, and it has, count them, 4 Hierophants guarding. I don't know, that for some reason that's just very funny to me. So yeah, as you do, as you would be excited to see, we do indeed have some pretty banging stuff going on. We got some epic men. We got some large armies being morphed, being trained, being deployed, being attacked. And this bottom team has mostly been on the bottom foot, or the back foot, rather, it seems. I am expecting that the Zerg, considering they've got double gas here, and they've just secured their 3rd, and while they have lost some units, it doesn't look like they've had crippling blows suffered to their worker line. They should actually be okay, but they definitely, like, it all hinges on the next, like, large-scale attack that Violet sends out. So, just don't be surprised, I guess, is all I'm saying. Looks like he's even kited forward to get rid of a Mutalisk and then lost a couple Hydras in the process, but it's nothing big. And in fact, he's got some Lachizalisks. So this man is feeling it, man. This man is doing it all. Bactylisks, Lachizalisks, Skithricors, Nidus Canal blocking mineral fields. Not like completely, but still, what the fuck? What are you doing? Yeah, just the fact that this man's on 4 bases is incredibly spooky. And you know what? I like what I'm seeing. Corpses. So, yeah, actually, this could be a really big death now, considering that at the same time as he's taking out that 3rd from the orange, the Persian orange, Zerg player in the bottom left, he's also contesting and keeping the army of our Mint player in the bottom right pretty well stocked. Like, yeah, he's going to have to keep sending off these Acantors because even though this isn't a massive number of units, it's just that little bit of shit. It guarantees that this hatchery goes down, and indeed it does. Otherwise, maybe you don't see the same degree of, you know, shall we say, impressive contesting, because obviously that hatchery did take a little while to go down. And so maybe the combined might of their armies could have actually done something there. And now he's even going a step further, and it looks like the next one to be targeted for termination is indeed that Mint Robotos player in that bottom right location. So while this skirmish is enduring, indeed, it finally has fallen. The orange base has been given up, and they haven't been able to contest properly. There we go. We do indeed have orange taking the island expansion as a response. He definitely wants to re-up as soon as possible. I say wants, but I'm saying it colloquially because, of course, the AI is dumb and doesn't know what's going on. Okay, Demiurge out. All right, we might be able to take the fight to them. I'll take that. Thank you very much. Owned. Here we go. Who will I attach to, says the Sovrila. Aw, shit, your expansion's been found out, homie. How destructive. Yeah, I actually, you know, at the same time, by the same metric, I actually haven't seen much from the teal player. He hasn't taken an expansion. I mean, the only one that's left to take for him is the island or this one, which just freed up. Maybe that's a concern, actually, is the number of expansions available. Oh, they just now realized it wasn't their hatchery, I think. He's like, oh, I'm just used to owning the entire map, so it's kind of confusing. This is a pretty dirty one. Yeah, that's a pretty dirty one. The Lekizalisk being in there as well, that's going to help shred that. And, oh, actually, he's somehow managed to sneak off a bunch of units down this leftmost flank. Maybe even through, like, Ovalith transports or whatever, because obviously he's sieging this at the same time. So just off of this attack alone is pretty ferocious. And I think just with all of the significant number of economic defeats that this bottom team has suffered, I don't even know if it's possible for these guys to hold it down. I mean, the Protoss is pretty powerful, but he can't get out of his own base because he's got such a slow army that while it is formidable in the moment, as soon as it gets caught off guard by, like, the small armies of, like, you know, 20 supply here, 30 supply there of the Zerg, it's very thematic, actually, the way that the Zerg has ended up going around. And even with these air units coming in, yeah, they're only Skither Cores, Nather Cores, Mutalisks, they're all tier 1 shit, but it's still enough to destabilize the Acantors, especially if some ground units are holding them to the battlefield, right, and just causing them to constantly look for new targets, so to speak. So those going down, I mean, it's just the sustained pressure. This Lekizalisk seems quite confused. He doesn't know what's going on. He's just observing. He's a witness. He's converted his unit ID. And there you go. Yeah, this base is toast. Look at the lack of Drolets. We're back to, like, the early game for this guy. It's like he just main-arted all of his workers to his natural. He didn't, but that's what it looks like, because that's just... And that's a real tough spot to be in, of course. So don't be too surprised if this one goes the way that you seem to think it will go, based on how things are going right now. Pretty cheeky stealth base, and we do have purple deciding, fuck it, I'll take that island. And it looks like he's very slowly ferrying his units over because he doesn't... the Zerg AI don't yet know how to morph the greater transport strains. We'll work on that later on. Of course. Wait, which one is this? Oh, that's Teal. Okay. So this is the top right guy. He's actually deciding to take this base because he needs one desperately. His armies so far have actually been really hilariously, like, lame, where he's got a lot of, like, various units, but he's not actually adding them to attack waves. He's just like, they'll chill out. So otherwise he's just got Zealots and Legionnaires. And of course, he's fighting against a Cantors. Like, that's probably not the best tactic, buddy. But you know what? The sheer numbers combined with the Zerg here, of course, that it will win through the day. And that Demiurge is actually about to pop, which is obviously pretty bad for any units that have been mind controlled. Indeed, they will indeed cease their worship now that their false deity has indeed fallen. I don't know why I said indeed 30 times. I guess you could tell I'm out of practice with this whole castover thing. But don't worry, we'll get there eventually. So besides telling me that I need to find out what build this is and fix it up for the top right Protoss, it does look like these Zerg here have been pretty respectable. And you know what? I want to say that even though this Robotos was formidable in terms of how long he lasted, he didn't feel like he was nearly as active as this guy over here in the bottom left. And he tried so many times to keep himself alive, but somehow just like, 5 or 6 units, in this case a little bit more than that, show up to his bases and start destabilizing him just little by little. It's actually really funny to me that that's just the way that it's gone. This poor motherfucker in the bottom left. Well, it indeed does look like we'll be watching the Protoss, the Robotoss, fall in style. And you know what? It's a glorious sight. Holy shit! Envoys! Envoys! And another Nexus. Nobody ever would have guessed. No one would have suspected. I don't know how we got these Drolets in here. Oh shit. These are military AI Drolets. Fuck them up. When he's just like, man, I need to get some extra firepower. And he throws in workers. Well, that was a pretty interesting test. I will say some things, like I was saying in my spiel to begin with, were revealed that I wasn't expecting. For example, it was revealed that it's actually quite easy to just slink in a bunch of small groups of units in a couple of different places, not just the naturals for the inner player, where you can come at them from either this bridge or that bridge, but I would say also, like we saw cases where somehow the player had managed to like sort of flank all around just to get to this bottom right-hand area. I don't quite remember how that army pathed around and infiltrated. So that might actually be, maybe not a critical issue, but an issue we might want to take some steps to make less of a headache. I didn't notice build space issues, which I actually expected to see a little bit more. That doesn't mean that they can't exist. In fact, notably, we didn't see any Terran in that particular test, which I'm not saying Terran is significantly more build space conscious than Protoss, for example, but Zerg can get away with having wonky base layouts because their structures have lower collision sizes, and they can also get away with it because they just need less structures overall, and I would say less tiles per structure on average for the same kind of thing. Like their production is either a larval colony or it's a hatchery, right? So the hatcheries themselves obviously take up less collision space, and they don't really build super many of those, and they don't need to as much now because they can just evolve their hatcheries into layers and hives and so on. So all of those factors combine to make Zerg like not very space conscious, and that is not the case actually for Protoss and also for Terran. But Terran also build a different kind of style in some ways. They have different approaches for a lot of that stuff. So these are some things that are going through my head. Like, I wonder if the build space is actually sufficient. And I would hazard a guess to say it might not be. But that's just something that I think at this point, the layout is in its pretty final stages. I don't think I can make massive sweeping changes to something like the available build space. I think the mains are probably okay. Natural's still a point of contention, despite the fact that they have significantly ballooned in terms of, I think maybe I added like 33% more build space as like an arbitrary estimation compared to some of the earlier drafts that we saw. So I also think that this base in the top left hand, and as obviously the corollary being the bottom right, this base has a pretty decent amount of build space, especially if you stretch over to this top side. And obviously, if you're a player and not a goofy AI that doesn't build on multiple height levels, you can actually make use of this area. And then, you know, I wouldn't really want you to build anything over here. I would advise against building anything over here. But yeah, there's a couple of different things there. So first, obviously there's some issues that I didn't catch with the manually placed terrain. There's this bridge over here that and some of the surrounding tiles that are actually missing some stuff. And then there's this over here where I just forgot to replace the inner corner. This is what testing is for, ladies and gentlemen. Without testing, you may never notice these things. So there you go. That one's fixed, and we can fix this one up really quickly too. Okay, so with that resolved, I think most of the other issues, if we were going to call them issues, are just going to be decorating the map so it's not so one note all the time. It definitely, what I find is that, and this is something, again, I'll talk a little bit more often when we get into the next episode of this series, but I do find that when you get to a point where you can instantly orient yourself based on the terrain, the scenery that you're visually interfacing with, it actually becomes really, really easy to tell where you are on the map. Like if you know that only one area of the map has temple or jungle or whatever tile type you can think of, in this case it would be like ice or outpost or dirt, then that can help you know like, okay, based on what I know about this map and what the biome is like and how separated the visual elements are, yeah, that's absolutely something that you can sort of take to the bank as a player and then do with what you will. Obviously, we don't have transitionary tiles for the bridges, so I wouldn't want to actually do what I was talking about with the dirt water and stuff, because I do feel like that would be... we're missing a lot of tile blends that would make that possible, not just for the bridges, but also for like really edge case blend tiles like this with the dirt cliff, or the snow cliff as it were. So yeah, there's a number of things that we would need that we don't have in order to make that transition possible. And as a result, I don't think I could do something that bombastic. But that doesn't mean I have to avoid using dirt entirely. And I think for sure one of the things that I can do is just scatter some stuff here and there. So one of the things that I do want to accomplish is tightening up some of these choke points to make it just a little bit easier to lock down and to take advantageous angles and to make the aggressor work slightly more than they have to currently in order to get into an advantageous position, because it's not like it's impossible to infiltrate an army or whatever the case may be. But I think just adding a small grouping of doodads and maybe tiles of some sort that are unpathable, that can be sort of fought around and combated around, that will definitely help. I didn't notice too many big fights happening in the middle, and I think this is because in the AI test we just did, we didn't really see an even match. It was very much like, you know, the bottom left Zerg would attack the top left Zerg over this bridge in this area, and then from then on it was, you know, top right Protoss and top left Zerg just owning the other guys in the bottom right and in the bottom left. So we didn't really see any massive contention over here, but I believe that it's still quite a useful inclusion, quite a useful element to have in the project. So I'm not going to make any sweeping changes to it right now. I think it's fine that it's limited but not impossible build space. I also think that it should probably be decorated a little bit more to be brought out a bit more, because it's already pretty nice. Obviously, you got all the different elements of the coastal water, and it took me a long time to blend all that shit. And it's just interesting and compelling, I think, from a gameplay standpoint as well because of the layout, but you really bring it to life when you have the visuals and you have something that is unique to your map. We talked about this in the breakdown of the anatomy of a map, what makes a good map, and what makes a map exciting to play and enjoyable. One of those things is certainly something that you don't have to worry about if you're just brand new to the concept, but something that you should try to experiment with as soon as possible. Not necessarily a centerpiece, but just something that sets your map apart. And I happen to think that it becomes really easy to incorporate those unique elements in symmetrical maps if they are centerpieces. And when we get into asymmetrical maps, I'll show you some different tools and different takes on that kind of process. So yeah, sort of the final takeaways. I'm going to add some unpathable tiles in basically this area and its corresponding area, just to allow you to wall it off, wall one side off, try to contain armies, and essentially funnel and bottleneck armies a little bit more when they are taking these pathways out. And I'm going to see if I can't try to add a bit more cover to some of the other angles into these back-end bases, because they are supposed to be a little bit more secure than they felt in that one test. And I'm not going to make massive sweeping changes. This is also something I would encourage you to do, is if you see an issue and you think, oh, maybe that is actually an issue, and you think about it and you believe, yeah, I could probably use some improvements, I would actually suggest you to be rather conservative with your approach to how you fix it. Instead of just liberally changing a bunch of stuff and hoping for the best, it's actually better if you ease your way into it. I mean, assuming you don't have like a deadline or something, and you have as much time as you actually need to get the solution correct, there's no reason to jump the gun and immediately jump ahead. I think it's totally legit to just say, well, I don't actually know how much of this solution, like to what degree it needs to be implemented in order to solve the problem. So let's experiment. Let's try a little bit. And if I still feel like that's not enough, all right, we'll try a little bit more. Did I go too far? All right, pull it back a little bit. And then, also implementing the solution to begin with can be a nice way to figure out for yourself if that solution even is the solution you were looking for in the first place. So obviously, a lot to unpack, but I do feel like our map, particularly given the constrained space, actually looks like a pretty fun, scrappy, like mid-table map in terms of how long the games would be on. I feel like it would be pretty interesting to play some games on this map with and against human players, just as like a 2v2 AI even as a scenario or something, with like early game rush personalities perhaps. I could see games that end really soon, like 8 minutes in or whatever. I could also see games that last maybe upwards of like 25, 30 minutes, just because of the small number of bases. Again, we can't change the number of expansions at this point. I don't think we can make sweeping layout decisions now because it's pretty much locked. And if I were going to make some significantly different kind of map, if I was going to turn this into a different kind of map, it would just be better for me to start from square one. on the basis that this map is already pretty much finished. So at this point, I think it's fine to decorate the map, make some final layout changes, and then proverbially cut my losses, so to speak, and move on to the next project, which will, of course, be an asymmetrical scenario map that you can look forward to seeing the making of video and my primer on those, especially if you're interested in making like campaign content, or you're just interested in making single player content, or you're not interested in making melee maps at all, and you've just been like gritting your teeth, white knuckling it through these videos. I hope you learned something useful, and I think a lot of these lessons that I've imparted here are useful even for something like making single player content. But we are going to get into the weeds with single player, custom campaign style content that is asymmetric, that doesn't involve just everybody starting from melee conditions, and doesn't involve symmetry, and allows you to be more free form with your layout, your theme, your decisions, and doesn't really care too much about balance in the sense of making sure that like every single player or every single race can play from every single player position, because you have some of those elements preset. So we're going to get into that, and I hope you're as excited about it as I am. And that'll be it. Signing off.